with Poe. I apologize in advance. I have a little cold and a sporadic cough. So I hope it doesn't do anything wrong with the. Did I seriously not start my mic? Why isn't the audio working? Oh, that's why. Got it. We're good. And again, it says I'm not. That says I'm not streaming. I'm streaming over here. I can't find myself in browse, but you know what? I'm gonna have a good time by myself if I need to. So, here we go. We have quite a few to get to. I passed over Eureka because it seems to be a more technical one, which I would actually like to read myself and actually understand. It's about the spiritual and physical contrast of the universe. Um, and I love that sort of thing. And looking at the poetry reading from last time, I messed up and misunderstood several things that I should have understood had I been really focused. So I'm going to read that one on my own. And I also passed over there it is. Sorry. The back and forth. Hang on. This should be a fun 3-ish hours. Because I'm all alone. Oh, wait, I can't sing that because it's probably copyrighted. Anyway, we're just going to go ahead. I'm just going to go ahead. Since I'm the only one here. Maybe someone will find the VOD. Maybe not. Doesn't matter. It's going to be a good time. We're getting through Poe. Where is our cosmic horror? So these first couple are very short. I just cannot find the about there. No. Well, I'm pretty sure these first two have like a horror sort of a thing, like a little short horror. So little bite-sized horror. So that should be fun. Especially since it's Poe, who is a master. Was a master. Anywho, shit. Do I want that? Oh, that's me. Haha. Okay, we're good. Shadow, a Parable by Edgar Allan Poe. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow, Psalm of David. Ye who read are still among the living, but I who write shall have long since gone my way into the region of shadows. For indeed strange things shall happen, and secret things be known, and many centuries shall pass away ere these memorials be seen of men. And when seen there will be some to disbelieve, and some to doubt, and yet a few who will find much to ponder upon in the characters here graven with a stylus of iron. The year had been a year of terror, and of feelings more intense than terror, for which there is no name upon the earth. For many prodigies and signs had taken place, and far and wide, over sea and land, the black wings of the pestilence, how fitting, were spread abroad. To those, nevertheless, cunning in the stars, it was not unknown that the heavens wore an aspect of ill, and to me, the Greek Oinos, among others, it was evident that now had arrived the alternation of that 794th year when, at the entrance of Aries, the planet Jupiter is conjoined with the red ring of the terrible Saturnus. The peculiar spirit of the skies, if I mistake not greatly, made itself manifest, not only in the physical orb of the earth, but in the souls, imaginations, and meditations of mankind. Over some flasks of the red Chian wine, within the walls of a noble hall, in a dim city called Ptolemais, we sat at night a company of 7. And to our chamber there was no entrance save by a lofty door of brass, and the door was fashioned by the artisan Corinos, and, being of rare workmanship, was fastened from... Gosh darn it! Was fashioned from... within. Sorry. Black was fashioned from... hang on. And the door was fashioned, the brass door, and the door was fashioned by the artisan Corinos, and, being of rare workmanship, was fastened from within. I'm going to go insane. Black draperies, how fitting for Poe, Black draperies, likewise, in the gloomy room, shut out from our view the moon, the lurid stars, and the peopleless streets. But the boding and the memory of evil, they would not be so excluded. There were things around us and about of which I can render no distinct account, things material and spiritual, heaviness in the atmosphere, a sense of suffocation, anxiety, and above all, that terrible state of existence which the nervous experience when the senses are keenly living and awake, and meanwhile the powers of thought lie dormant. Ooh, I like that. Hang on. Up. A dead weight hung upon us. It hung upon our limbs, upon the household furniture, upon the goblets from which we drank, and all things were depressed and borne down thereby. All things save only the flames of the 7 iron lamps which illumined our revel. Uprearing themselves in tall, slender lines of light, they thus remained burning all pallid and motionless, and in the mirror which their luster formed upon the round table of ebony at which we sat, each of us there assembled beheld the pallor of his own countenance, and the unquiet glare in the downcast eyes of his companions. Yet we laughed and were merry in our proper way, which was hysterical, and sang the songs of Anacreon, which are madness, and drank deeply, although the purple wine reminded us of blood. For there was yet another tenant of our chamber in the person of young Zoilus. Dead, and at full length he lay, enshrouded, the genius and the demon of the scene. Alas, he bore no portion in our mirth, save that his countenance, distorted with the plague, and his eyes in which death had but half extinguished the fire of the pestilence, seemed to take such interest in our merriment as the dead may haply take in the merriment of those who are to die. Interesting. But although I, Oinos, felt that the eyes of the departed were upon me, still I forced myself not to perceive the bitterness of their expression, and gazing down steadily into the depths of the ebony mirror, sang with a loud and sonorous voice the songs of the son of Teos. But gradually my songs they ceased, and their echoes, rolling afar off among the sable draperies of the chamber, became weak and undistinguishable, and so faded away. And lo, from among those sable draperies, where the sounds of the song departed, there came forth a dark and undefined shadow, a shadow such as the moon, when low in heaven, might fashion from the figure of a man. But it was the shadow neither of man, nor of God, nor of any familiar thing. And quivering a while among the draperies of the room, it at length rested in full view upon the surface of the door of brass. But the shadow was vague, and formless, and indefinite, and was the shadow neither of man nor God, neither God of Greece, nor God of Chaldea, nor any Egyptian god. And the shadow rested upon the brazen doorway, and under the arch of the entablature of the door, and moved not, nor spoke any word, but there became stationary and remained. And the door whereupon the shadow rested was, if I remember aright, over against the feet of the young Zoilus enshrouded. But we, the 7 there assembled, having seen the shadow as it came out from among the draperies, dared not steadily behold it, but cast down our eyes, and gazed continually into the depths of the mirror of ebony. And at length I, Oinos, speaking some low words, demanded of the shadow its dwelling and its appellation. And the shadow answered, I am Shadow, and my dwelling is near to the catacombs of Ptolemaeus, and hard by those dim plains of Helusion, which border upon the foul Charonian canal. And then did we, the 7, start from our seats in horror, and stand trembling, and shuddering, and aghast. For the tones in the voice of the shadow were not the tones of any one being, but of a multitude of beings, and varying in their cadences from syllable to syllable, fell duskily upon our ears in the well-remembered and familiar accents of many thousand departed friends. Ooh, that was awesome. I am Legion. I am Shadow. Fantastic. I loved it. Sorry for the mispronunciations. Oh, very, very good. I need to read Greek stuff again. Perhaps after Shakespeare, we will go into the Greeks. That would be fun. I would like to get back into that. Especially because of all the Greek stuff that I don't understand. Maybe I'll learn Greek. Why not? Silence a fable. I'll see if I can find what that means. Silence a fable. Oops. Dun, dun. Autocorrect. The bane of my existence. This one said silence a sonnet. Ba-ba-ba-bum. Um. Oh, sorry. Just kidding. That's not. Oh, boo. Mm. Mm. It's not telling me. So we're just going to move on and hope it's not entirely necessary. We'll see what this says for translatory purposes. Peaks and gorges and ravines. Interesting. Oh! I'm gonna guess that the mountain pinnacles slumber, valleys, crags, and caves are silent, is probably the translation. Good job, Heidi. Mm. We solved the mystery. Silence, a Fable by Edgar Allan Poe. The mountain pinnacles slumber, valleys, crags, and caves are silent. Alkman. Listen to me, said the demon as he placed his hand upon my head. The region of which I speak is a dreary region in Libya, by the borders of the river Zaire, and there is no quiet there, nor silence. The waters of the river have a saffron and sickly hue, and they flow not onward to the sea, but palpitate forever and forever beneath the red eye of the sun with a tumultuous and convulsive motion. For many miles on either side of the river's oozy bed is a pale desert of gigantic water lilies. They sigh one onto the other in that solitude, and stretch towards the heaven their long and ghastly necks, and nod to and fro their everlasting heads. And there is an indistinct murmur which cometh out from among them like the rushing of subterrene water. And they sigh one onto the other. But there is a boundary to their realm, the boundary of the dark, horrible, lofty forest. There, like the waves about the Hebrides, the low underwood is agitated continually, but there is no wind throughout the heaven, and the tall primeval trees rock eternally hither and thither with a crashing and mighty sound, and from their high summits, one by one, drop everlasting dews, and at the roots strange poisonous flowers lie writhing in perturbed slumber, and overhead with a rustling and loud noise, the gray clouds rush westwardly forever, until they roll, a cataract over the fiery wall of the horizon. But there is no wind throughout the heaven, and by the shores of the river Zaire there is neither quiet nor silence. It was night, and the rain fell, and falling it was rain, but having fallen, it was blood. And I stood in the morass among the tall lilies, and the rain fell upon my head, and the lilies sighed one unto the other in the solemnity of their desolation. And all at once the moon arose through the thin, ghastly mist, and was crimson in color, and mine eyes fell upon a huge gray rock which stood by the shore of the river, and was lighted by the light of the moon. And the rock was gray and ghastly and tall, and the rock was gray and ghastly and tall, and the rock was gray. Upon its front were characters engraven in the stone, and I walked through the morass of water lilies until I came close onto the shore, that I might read the characters upon the stone, but I could not decipher them. And I was going back into the morass when the moon shone with a fuller red, and I turned and looked again upon the rock and upon the characters, and the characters were desolation. And I looked upwards, and there stood a man upon the summit of the rock, and I hid myself among the water lilies, that I might discover the actions of the man. And the man was tall and stately in form, and was wrapped up from his shoulders to his feet in the toga of old Rome. And the outlines of his figure were indistinct, but his features were the features of a deity, for the mantle of the night, and of the mist, and of the moon, and of the dew, had left uncovered the features of his face. And his brow was lofty with thought, and his eye wild with care, and in the few furrows upon his cheek I read the fables of sorrow, and weariness, and disgust with mankind, and a longing after solitude. And the man sat upon the rock, and leaned his head upon his hand, and looked out upon the desolation. He looked down into the low, unquiet shrubbery, and up into the tall primeval trees, and up higher at the rustling heaven, and into the crimson moon. And I lay close within shelter of the lilies, and observed the actions of the man. And the man trembled in the solitude, but the night waned, and he sat upon the rock. And the man turned his attention from the heaven, and looked out upon the dreary river Zaire, and upon the yellow ghastly waters, and upon the pale legions of the water lilies. And the man listened to the sighs of the water lilies, and to the murmur that came up from among them. And I lay close within my covert, and observed the actions of the man. And the man trembled in the solitude. But the night waned, and he sat upon the rock. Then I went down into the recesses of the morass, and waded afar in among the wilderness of the lilies, and called unto the hippopotami which dwelt among the fens in the recesses of the morass. And the hippopotami heard my call, and came with the behemoth onto the foot of the rock, and roared loudly and fearfully beneath the moon. And I lay close within my covert, and observed the actions of the man. And the man trembled in the solitude, but the night waned, and he sat upon the rock. Then I cursed the elements with the curse of tumult, and a frightful tempest gathered in the heaven, where before there had been no wind. And the heaven became livid with the violence of the tempest, and the rain beat upon the head of the man. And the floods of the river came down, and the river was tormented into foam, and the water lilies shrieked within their beds, and the forest crumbled before the wind, and the thunder rolled, and the lightning fell, and the rock rocked to its foundation. And I lay close within my covert, and observed the actions of the man. And the man trembled in the solitude, but the night waned, and he sat upon the rock. Then I grew angry, and cursed with the curse of silence the river, and the lilies, and the wind, and the forest, and the heaven, and the thunder, and the sighs of the water lilies. And they became accursed, and were still. And the moon ceased to totter up its pathway to heaven, and the thunder died away, and the lightning did not flash, and the clouds hung motionless, and the waters sunk to their level and remained. And the trees ceased to rock, and the water lilies sighed no more, and the murmur was heard no longer from among them, nor any shadow of sound throughout the vast, illimitable desert. And I looked upon the characters of the rock, and they were changed, and the characters were silence. And mine eyes fell upon the countenance of the man, and his countenance was wan with terror, and hurriedly he raised his head from his hand, and stood forth upon the rock and listened. But there was no voice throughout the vast, illimitable desert, and the characters upon the rock were silence. And the man shuddered, and turned his face away, and fled afar off in haste, so that I beheld him no more. Now there are fine tales of the volumes of the Magi, in the iron-bound, melancholy volumes of the Magi. Therein, I say, are glorious histories of the heaven, and of the earth, and of the mighty sea, and of the genii that overruled the sea, and the earth, and the lofty heaven. There was much lore, too, in the sayings which were said by the Sibyls, and holy, holy things were heard of old by the dim leaves that trembled around Dodona. But, as Allah liveth, that fable which the demon told me, as he sat by my side in the shadow of the tomb, I hold to be the most wonderful of all. And as the demon made an end of his story, he fell back within the cavity of the tomb and laughed. And I could not laugh with the demon, and he cursed me because I could not laugh. And the lynx which dwelleth forever in the tomb came out therefrom, and lay down at the feet of the demon, and looked at him steadily in the face. Okay. Incredibly interesting. So we're just going to put this part aside for now. I love that idea of silence being what frightens the man away. Because there isn't a whole lot of silence nowadays, is there? Because what would happen if there was? We would have to think and deal with ourselves and self-reflect. And to be quite honest, how many of us enjoy that? I have so many things to say on this subject. I don't know if I want to get into it right now. But it is something of today where people don't enjoy solitude. They crave the stimulation, company, all of that. And I do think that it has something to do, at least in part, with the inability to deal with themselves. Personally, not to toot my horn, I quite enjoy being by myself, enjoying the theme park that is my mind. There's so many things to learn and read and enjoy solitarily. And where was it? Yeah, this part. Lofty with thought, eyes wild with care, in the few furrows upon his cheek I read the fables of sorrow and weariness and disgust with mankind and a longing after solitude. There are times that I feel that, and I feel that a lot of people feel that as well. But it's difficult. There's a difference between solitude and silent solitude, if that makes sense. So, yeah, I don't know, there's something to be learned in there, I guess. As of this, I believe that this probably has history, um, that this final bit, that it has history that I don't understand. I don't have a background in, so I can't say much on that. Um, but yeah, it was. Sorry. It was an interesting ending to it, and if I had the background, I would be um, curious to understand how it really fit with the rest of it. Um, but yeah, so curse of silence, but yet he cursed him because he couldn't laugh. So he's already cursed with silence, but I don't. Oh, unless it was just because he's dead and he's dragging him to hell. I don't know. Anyway, I don't know, so we're just going to move on. That was Silence, a Fable. This is Philosophy of Furniture, which is just. Sorry. Mm, literally post thoughts on interior decorating. Sure, I'm interested. I actually. I have a. I can enjoy and appreciate aesthetic. I cannot create it for the life of me. And I think that it gets into it a little bit in here, the things that I have an issue with, where I can't figure it out. So we'll see. Philosophy of Furniture, Horror and Demonism, and Now Furniture. Philosophy of Furniture by Edgar Allan Poe. In the internal decoration, if not in the external architecture of their residences, the English are supreme. Biased, the Italians have but little sentiment beyond marbles and colors. In France, meliora probant, deteriora secuntur. Better prove so, the inferior follow, though. In France, the inferior follow. I don't know. The people are too much a race of gadabouts to maintain those household proprieties of which, indeed, they have a delicate appreciation, or at least the elements of a proper sense. The Chinese and most of the Eastern races have a warm but inappropriate fancy. The Scotch are poor decorists. The Dutch have perhaps an indeterminate idea that a curtain is not a cabbage. In Spain, they are all curtains, a nation of hangmen. The Russians do not furnish. The Hottentots and Kickapoos are very well in their way. The Yankees alone are preposterous. How this happens, it is not difficult to see. We have no aristocracy of blood, and having therefore as a natural and indeed as an inevitable thing, fashioned for ourselves an aristocracy of dollars, the display of wealth has here to take the place and perform the office of the heraldic display in monarchical countries. By a transition readily understood, and which might have been as readily foreseen, we have been brought to merge in simple show our notions of taste itself. To speak less abstractly, in England, for example, no mere parade of costly appurtenances would be so likely as with us to create an impression of the beautiful in respect to the appurtenances themselves, or of taste as regards the proprietor. This for the reason, first, that wealth is not, in England, the loftiest object of ambition as constituting a nobility, and secondly, that there, the true nobility of blood, confining itself within the strict limits of legitimate taste, rather avoids than affects that mere costliness in which a parvenu rivalry may at any time be successfully attempted. The people will imitate the nobles, and the result is a thorough diffusion of the proper feeling. But in America, the coins current being the sole arms of the aristocracy, their display may be said, in general, to be the sole means of aristocratic distinction. And the populace, looking always upward for models, are insensibly led to confound the two entirely separate ideas of magnificence and beauty. I love it. two entirely separate ideas of magnificence and beauty. In short, the cost of an article of furniture has at length come to be, with us, nearly the sole test of its merit in a decorative point of view, and this test, once established, has led the way to many analogous errors, readily traceable to the one primitive folly. There could be nothing more directly offensive to the eye of an artist than the interior of what is termed in the United States, that is to say, in Appalachia, a well furnished apartment. Its most usual defect is a want of keeping. We speak of the keeping of a room as we would of the keeping of a picture, for both the picture and the room are amenable to those undeviating principles which regulate all varieties of art, and very nearly the same laws by which we decide on the higher merits of a painting suffice for decision on the adjustment of a chamber. A want of keeping is observable sometimes in the character of the several pieces of furniture, but generally in their colors or modes of adaptation to use. Very often the offended, I, oh sorry, very often the eye is offended by their inartistical arrangement. Straight lines are too prevalent, too uninterruptedly continued, or clumsily interrupted at right angles. If curved lines occur, they are repeated into unpleasant uniformity. By undue precision, the appearance of many a fine apartment is utterly spoiled. Yeah, that's probably around my my issue, at least part of it. Fair, fair enough. Come on, let me highlight it. Okay. Curtains are rarely well disposed or well chosen in respect to other decorations. With formal furniture, curtains are out of place, and an extensive volume of drapery of any kind is, under any circumstances, irreconcilable with good taste. The proper quantum, as well as the proper adjustment, depending upon the character of the general effect. Carpets are better understood of late than of ancient days, but we still very frequently err in their patterns and colors. The soul of the apartment is the carpet. From it are deduced not only the hues but the forms of all objects incumbent. A judge at common law may be an ordinary man. A good judge of a carpet must be a genius. Yet we have heard discoursing of carpets with the air d'un mouton qui rive. Going to be a lot of French in some of these. If a sheep which banks, of a sheep which banks. Yet we have heard discoursing of carpets with the air of a sheep which banks. I don't know what that means. Fellows who should not and who could not be entrusted with the management of their own mustaches. Everyone knows that a large floor may have a covering of large figures, and that a small one must have a covering of small. Sorry, everyone knows that a large floor may have a covering of large figures, and that a small one must have a covering of small. Do we? Does everyone know this? Not I, not I. Yet this is not all the knowledge in the world. As regards the texture, the Saxony is alone admissible. Brussels is the Preter pluperfect? Preter pluperfect. That's also a great word. Tense of fashion. The Saxony As regards texture, the Saxony is alone admissible. Brussels is the Brussels is the preterpluperfect tense of fashion, and Turkey is taste in its dying agonies. Touching pattern. A carpet should not be bedizened out like a Rickery Indian, all red chalk, yellow ochre, and cock's feathers. In brief, distinct grounds, and vivid circular or cycloid figures of no meaning are here median laws. The abomination of flowers or representations of well-known objects of any kind should not be endured within the limits of Christendom. Indeed, whether on carpets or curtains or tapestry or ottoman coverings, all upholstery of this nature should be rigidly arabesque. As for those antique floor cloths still occasionally seen in the dwellings of the rabble, cloths of huge, sprawling, and radiating devices, stripe interspersed and glorious with all hues, among which no ground is intelligible, these are but the wicked invention of a race of time-servers and money-lovers, children of Baal and worshippers of Mammon. Mammon. Benthams, who, to spare thought and economize fancy, first cruelly invented the kaleidoscope, and then established joint stock companies to twirl it by steam. Glare is a leading error in the philosophy of American household decoration, an error easily recognized as deduced from the perversion of taste just specified. We are violently enamored of gas and of glass. The former is totally inadmissible within doors. Its harsh and unsteady light offends. No one having both brains and eyes will use it. A mild, or what artists term a cool light, with its consequent warm shadows, will do wonders for even an ill furnished apartment. Interesting. I'm kind of wanting to try and decorate something using all of this. Oops, oops, oops. Will do. Will do. Will do wonders. A mild, or what artists term a cool light, with its consequent warm shadows, will do wonders for even an ill furnished apartment. Never was a more lovely thought than that of the astral lamp. We mean, of course, the astral lamp proper, the lamp of Argand, with its original plain ground glass shade and its tempered and uniform moonlight rays. The cut glass shade is a weak invention of the enemy. The eagerness with which we have adopted it, partly on account of its flashiness, but principally on account of its greater cost, is a good commentary on the proposition with which we began. It is not too much to say that the deliberate employer of a cut glass shade is either radically deficient in taste or blindly subservient to the caprices of fashion. The light proceeding from one of these gaudy abominations is unequal, broken, and painful. It alone is sufficient to mar a world of good effect in the furniture subjected to its influence. Female loveliness, in especial, is more than one half disenchanted beneath its evil eye. Good to know. In the matter of glass, generally, we proceed upon false principles. Its leading feature is glitter, and in that one word, how much of all that is detestable do we express? Flickering, unquiet lights are sometimes pleasing, to children and idiots always so, but in the embellishment of a room they should be scrupulously avoided. In truth, even strong, steady lights are inadmissible. The huge and unmeaning glass chandeliers, prism-cut, gas-lighted, and without shade, which dangle in our most fashionable drawing rooms, may be cited as the quintessence of all that is false in taste or preposterous in folly. He has very, very strong feelings on this subject. The rage for glitter, because its idea has become, as we before observed, confounded with that of magnificence in the abstract, has led us also to the exaggerated employment of mirrors. We line our dwellings with great British plates and then imagine we have done a fine thing. Now the slightest thought will be sufficient to convince anyone who has an eye at all of the ill effect of numerous looking glasses, and especially of large ones. Regarded apart from its reflection, the mirror presents a continuous, flat, colorless, unrelieved surface, a thing always and obviously unpleasant. Considered as a reflector, it is potent in producing a monstrous and odious uniformity, and the evil is here aggravated, not in merely direct proportion with the augmentation of its sources, but in a ratio constantly increasing. In fact, a room with 4 or 5 mirrors arranged at random is, for all purposes of artistic show, a room of no shape at all. If we add to this evil the attendant glitter upon glitter, we have a perfect farrago. Oops. A confused mixture, farrago. Oop. We have a perfect farrago of discordant and displeasing effects. The veriest bumpkin, on entering an apartment so bedizened, would be instantly aware of something wrong, although he might be altogether unable to assign a cause for his dissatisfaction. But let the same person be led into a room tastefully furnished, and he would be startled into an exclamation of pleasure and surprise. I also like this word. That's excellent. It is an evil growing out of our republican institutions that here a man of large purse has usually a very little soul which he keeps in it. The corruption of taste is a portion or a pendant of the dollar manufacture. Interesting. Oops. As we grow rich, our ideas grow rusty. It is therefore not among our aristocracy that we must look, if at all in Appalachia, for the spirituality of a British boudoir. But we have seen apartments in the tenure of Americans of modern means, which, in negative merit at least, might vie with any of the Ormolude. Ormolude? No idea. Cabinets of our friends across the water. Even now there is present to our mind's eye a small and not ostentatious chamber with whose decorations no fault can be found. The proprietor lies asleep on a sofa. The weather is cool. The time is near midnight. We will make a sketch of the room during his slumber. It is oblong, some 30 feet in length, and 25 in breadth, a shape affording the best ordinary opportunities for the adjustment of furniture. It has but one door, by no means a wide one, which is at one end of the parallelogram, and but two windows, which are at the other. These latter are large and reaching down to the floor, have deep recesses, and open on an Italian veranda. Their panes are of a crimson tinted glass, set in rosewood framings, more massive than usual. They are curtained within the recess by a thick silver tissue adapted to the shape of the window, and hanging loosely in small volumes. Without the recess are curtains of an exceedingly rich crimson silk, fringed with a deep network of gold, and lined with the silver tissue which is the material of the exterior blind. There are no cornices, but the folds of the whole fabric, which are sharp rather than massive, and have an airy appearance, issue from beneath a broad entablature of rich gilt work, which encircles the room at the junction of the ceiling and walls. The drapery is thrown open also, or closed by means of a thick rope of gold loosely enveloping it and resolving itself readily into a knot. No pins or other such devices are apparent. The colors of the curtains and their fringe, the tints of crimson and gold, appear everywhere in profusion and determine the character of the room. The carpet, of Saxony material, is quite half an inch thick and is of the same crimson ground, relieved simply by the appearance of a gold cord, like that festooning the curtains, slightly relieved above the surface of the ground, and thrown upon it in such a manner as to form a succession of short, irregular curves, one occasionally overlaying the other. The walls are prepared with a glossy paper of a silver gray tint, spotted with small arabesque devices of a fainter hue of the prevalent crimson. Many paintings relieve the expanse of the paper. These are chiefly landscapes of an imaginative cast, such as the fairy grottos of Stanfield or the lake of the dismal swamp of Chapman. There are nevertheless 3 or 4 female heads of an ethereal beauty, portraits in the manner of Sully. The tone of each picture is warm but dark. There are no brilliant effects. Repose speaks in all. Not one is of small size. Diminutive paintings give that spotty look to a room, which is the blemish of so many a fine work of art overtouched. The frames are broad but not deep, and richly carved, without being dulled or filigreed. They have the whole luster of burnished gold. They lie flat on the walls and do not hang off with cords. The designs themselves are often seen to better advantage in this latter position, but the general appearance of the chamber is injured. But one mirror, and this not a very large one, is visible. In shape it is nearly circular, and it is hung so that a reflection of the person can be obtained from it in none of the ordinary sitting places of the room. 2 large, low sofas of rosewood and crimson silk, gold-flowered, form the only seats, the exception of 2 light conversation chairs, also of rosewood. There is a pianoforte, rosewood also, without cover, and thrown open. An octagonal table, formed altogether of the richest gold-threaded marble, is placed near one of the sofas. This is also without cover. The drapery of the curtains has been thought sufficient. 4 large and gorgeous Sèvres vases, Sèvres, a type, Sèvres, Sèvres, a type of fine porcelain characterized by elaborate decoration on backgrounds of intense color, made at Sèvres in the suburbs of Paris. Sèvres, sure. And 4 large and gorgeous Sèvres vases, in which bloom a profusion of sweet and vivid flowers, occupy the slightly rounded angles of the room. A tall candelabrum, bearing a small antique lamp with highly perfumed oil, is standing near the head of my sleeping friend. Some light and graceful hanging shelves, with golden edges and crimson silk cords with gold tassels, sustain 200 or 300 magnificently bound books. Beyond these things there is no furniture, if we except an argand lamp, with a plain, crimson-tinted ground glass shade, which depends from the lofty vaulted ceiling by a single slender gold chain, and throws a tranquil but magical radiance over all. That was beautiful, interesting, not horrific. Not. I thought it was actually quite comedic, the way that he was raging about the aesthetic. I would be interested in seeing this room. I'm sure someone has either depicted it in art form or potentially maybe actually decorated something like it. That would be interesting to look at to see what his... Although he did say something about injured. The designs of the tapestries, the frames, the paintings. So yes, the portraits, portraits in the manner of Sully, tone of each picture, yes, of women. Frames broad, not deep, luster burnished gold, lie flat on the walls, do not hang off with cords. Designs themselves are often seen to better advantage in this latter position, but the general appearance of the chamber is injured. I almost want to say he probably meant uninjured, but I don't know. So that was Edgar Allan Poe's philosophy of furniture. This one I read is actually a sorry. This one is apparently a parody of a the same story with just him taking the exact same text and rearranging it. So I was going to skip that one because it's not really his writing. A Tale of the Ragged Mountains, and this one has mesmerism in it and has to do, I want to say it was not based upon, but informed by his time spent in here. I'll find it so I'm not saying things wrong. Not a of ragged, not tagged, ragged. Okay, short story written by Edgar Allan Poe, partially based on his experience while a student at the University of Virginia. Set near Charlottesville, it is the only one of Poe's stories to take place in Virginia. And now that I'm thinking about it, I keep thinking that he's English. I'm pretty sure he was American. So that's interesting, right? Am I incorrect? Hang on. I'm pretty sure I'm correct. Yeah. So I misspoke when I said he was biased about the English having the. So he wrote that in the manner of the philosophy of furniture. He wrote it in a manner of him being English, which was interesting. Anywho, we shall continue. A Tale of the Ragged Mountains. During the fall of the year 1827, while residing near Charlottesville, Virginia, I casually made the acquaintance of Mr. Augustus Bedloe. This young gentleman was remarkable in every respect, and excited in me a profound interest and curiosity. I found it impossible to comprehend him either in his moral or his physical relations. Of his family I could obtain no satisfactory account. Whence he came I never ascertained. Even about his age, although I call him a young gentleman, there was something which perplexed me in no little degree. He certainly seemed young, and he made a point of speaking about his youth, yet there were moments when I should have had little trouble in imagining him 100 years of age. But in no regard was he more peculiar than in his personal appearance. He was singularly tall and thin. He stooped much. His limbs were exceedingly long and emaciated. His forehead was broad and low. His complexion was absolutely bloodless. His mouth was large and flexible, and his teeth were more wildly uneven, although sound, than I had ever before seen teeth in a human head. The expression of his smile, however, was by no means unpleasing, as might be supposed, but it had no variation whatever. It was one of profound melancholy, of a phaseless and unceasing gloom. His eyes were abnormally large and round like those of a cat. The pupils, too, upon any accession or diminution of light, underwent contraction or dilation, just such as is observed in the feline tribe. In moments of excitement, the orbs grew bright to a degree almost inconceivable, seeming to emit luminous rays, not of a reflected, but of an intrinsic luster, as does a candle or the sun. Yet their ordinary condition was so totally vapid, filmy, and dull as to convey the idea of the eyes of a long interred corpse. These peculiarities of person appeared to cause him much annoyance, and he was continually alluding to them in a sort of half-explanatory, half-apologetic strain, which, when I first heard it, impressed me very painfully. I soon, however, grew accustomed to it, and my uneasiness wore off. It seemed to be his design rather to insinuate than directly to assert that, physically, he had not always been what he was, that a long series of neuralgic attacks had reduced him from a condition of more than usual personal beauty to that which I saw. For many years past he had been attended by a physician named Templeton, an old gentleman, perhaps 70 years of age, whom he had first encountered at Saratoga, and from whose attention while there he either received, or fancied that he received, great benefit. The result was that Bedloe, who was wealthy, had made an arrangement with Dr. Templeton, by which the latter, in consideration of a liberal annual allowance, had consented to devote his time and medical experience exclusively to the care of the invalid. Dr. Templeton had been a traveler in his younger days, and at Paris had become a convert in great measure to the doctrines of Mesmer. It was altogether by means of magnetic remedies that he had succeeded in alleviating the acute pains of his patient, and this success had very naturally inspired the latter with a certain degree of confidence in the opinions from which the remedies had been educed. The doctor, however, like all enthusiasts, had struggled hard to make a thorough convert of his pupil, and finally so far gained his point as to induce the sufferer to submit to numerous experiments. By a frequent repetition of these, a result had arisen which of late days has become so common as to attract little or no attention, but which, at the period of which I write, had very rarely been known in America. I mean to say that between Dr. Templeton and Bedloe there had grown up, little by little, a very distinct and strongly marked rapport, or magnetic relation. I am not prepared to assert, however, that this rapport extended beyond the limits of the simple sleep-producing power, but this power itself had attained great intensity. At the first attempt to induce the magnetic somnolency, 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 the mesmerist entirely failed. In the fifth or sixth, he succeeded very partially, and after long continued effort. Only at the 12th was the triumph complete. After this, the will of the patient succumbed rapidly to that of the physician, so that, when I first became acquainted with the two, sleep was brought about almost instantaneously by the mere volition of the operator, even when the invalid was unaware of his presence. It is only now, in the year 1845, when similar miracles are witnessed daily by thousands, that I dare venture to record this apparent impossibility as a matter of serious fact. The temperature of Bedloe was, in the highest degree, sensitive, excitable, enthusiastic. His imagination was singularly vigorous and creative, and no doubt it derived additional force from the habitual use of morphine, which he swallowed in great quantity, and without which he would have found it impossible to exist. It was his practice to take a very large dose of it immediately after breakfast each morning, or rather immediately after a cup of strong coffee, for he ate nothing in the forenoon, and then set forth alone, or attended only by a dog, upon a long ramble among the chain of wild and dreary hills that lie westward and southward of Charlottesville, and are there dignified by the title of the Ragged Mountains. Roll credits. Upon a dim, warm, misty day, towards the close of November, and during the strange interregnum of the seasons, which in America is termed the Indian summer, Mr. Bedloe departed as usual for the hills. The day passed, and still he did not return. About 8 o'clock at night, having become seriously alarmed at his protracted absence, we were about setting out in search of him, when he unexpectedly made his appearance, in health no worse than usual, and in rather more than ordinary spirits. The account which he gave of his expedition, and of the events which had detained him, was a singular one indeed. "You will remember," said he, "that it was about 9 in the morning when I left Charlottesville. I bent my steps immediately to the mountains, and, about 10, entered a gorge which was entirely new to me. I followed the windings of this pass with much interest. The scenery which presented itself on all sides, although scarcely entitled to be called grand, had about it an indescribable and to me a delicious aspect of dreary desolation. The solitude seemed absolutely virgin. I could not help believing that the green sods and the gray rocks upon which I trod had been trodden never before by the foot of a human being. So entirely secluded and in fact inaccessible, except through a series of accidents, is the entrance of the ravine." Oops, sorry, I just realized I should probably check my... Okay. It seems okay. Sorry. I could not help, so entirely secluded and in fact inaccessible, except through a series of accidents, is the entrance of the ravine, that it is by no means impossible that I was indeed the first adventurer, the very first and sole adventurer who had ever penetrated its recesses. The thick and peculiar mist or smoke which distinguishes the Indian summer, and which now hung heavily over all objects, served, no doubt, to deepen the vague impressions which these objects created. So dense was this pleasant fog that I could at no time see more than a dozen yards of the path before me. This path was excessively sinuous, and as the sun could not be seen, I soon lost all idea of the direction in which I journeyed. In the meantime, the morphine had its customary effect, that of that of enduing all the external world with an intensity of interest. In the quivering of a leaf, in the hue of a blade of grass, in the shape of a trefoil, in the humming of a bee, in the gleaming of a dewdrop, in the breathing of the wind, in the faint odors that came from the forest, there came a whole universe of suggestion, a gay and motley train of rhapsodical and immethodical thought. That was beautiful. Trefoil. Truffle? Beautiful. It's green, so we'll make it green. Busied in this, I walked on for several hours, during which the mist deepened around me to so great an extent that at length I was reduced to an absolute groping of the way. And now an indescribable uneasiness possessed me, a species of nervous hesitation and tremor. I feared to tread, lest I should be precipitated into some abyss. I remembered, too, strange stories told about these ragged hills, and of the uncouth and fierce races of men who tenanted their groves and caverns. I thought that you said that it was untrodden. A thousand vague fancies oppressed and disconcerted me, fancies the more distressing because vague. Very suddenly, my attention was arrested by the loud beating of a drum. Ah, come back. Wanted to highlight that too. Aren't they always? Fancies more distressing because vague. My amazement was of course extreme. A drum in these hills was a thing unknown. I could not have been more surprised at the sound of the trump of the archangel, but a new and still more astounding source of interest and perplexity arose. There came a wild rattling or jingling sound, as if of a bunch of large keys, and upon the instant a dusky visaged and half-naked man rushed past me with a shriek. He came so close to my person that I felt his hot breath upon my face. He bore in one hand an instrument composed of an assemblage of steel rings, and shook them vigorously as he ran. Scarcely had he disappeared in the mist, before, panting after him with open mouth and glaring eyes, there darted a huge beast. I could not be mistaken in his character. It was a hyena. The sight of this monster rather relieved than heightened my terrors, for I now made sure that I dreamed, and endeavored to arouse myself to waking consciousness. I stepped boldly and briskly forward. I rubbed my eyes. I called aloud. I pinched my limbs. A small spring of water presented itself to my view, and here, stooping, I bathed my hands and my head and neck. This seemed to dissipate the equivocal sensations which had hitherto annoyed me. I arose as I thought a new man, and proceeded steadily and complacently on my unknown way. At length, quite overcome by exertion, and by a certain oppressive closeness of the atmosphere, I seated myself beneath a tree. Presently there came a feeble gleam of sunshine, and the shadow of the leaves of the tree fell faintly but definitely upon the grass. At this shadow I gazed wonderingly for many minutes. Its character stupefied me with astonishment. I looked upward. The tree was a palm. I now arose hurriedly and in a state of fearful agitation, for the fancy that I dreamed would serve me no longer. I felt that I had perfect command of my senses, and these senses now brought to my soul a world of novel and singular sensation. The heat became all at once intolerable. A strange odor loaded the breeze. A low, continuous murmur, like that arising from a full but gently flowing river, came to my ears, intermingled with the peculiar hum of multitudinous human voices. While I listened in an extremity of astonishment, which I need not attempt to describe, a strong and brief gust of wind bore off the incumbent fog as if by the wand of an enchanter. I found myself at the foot of a high mountain and looking down into a vast plain through which wound a majestic river. On the margin of this river stood an eastern-looking city, such as we read of in the Arabian tales, but of a character even more singular than any there described. From my position, which was far above the level of the town, I could perceive its every nook and corner, as if delineated on a map. The streets seemed innumerable, and crossed each other irregularly in all directions, but were rather long, winding alleys than streets, and absolutely swarmed with inhabitants. The houses were wildly picturesque. On every hand was a wilderness of balconies, of verandas, of minarets, of shrines, and fantastically carved oriels. Bazaars abounded, and in these were displayed rich wares in infinite variety and profusion. Silks, muslins, the most dazzling cutlery, the most magnificent jewels and gems. Besides these things were seen, on all sides, banners and palanquins, litters with stately dames close veiled, elephants gorgeously caparisoned? Caparisoned? Where did it let me see it? Capar- Caparisoned of a horse be decked out in rich decorative coverings. Litters with stately dames, close veiled, elephants gorgeously caparisoned, idols grotesquely hewn, drums, banners, and gongs, spears, silver, and gilded maces. And amid the crowd and the clamor, and the general intricacy and confusion, amid the million of black and yellow men, turbaned and robed, and of flowing beard, there roamed a countless multitude of holy filleted bulls, while vast legions of the filthy but sacred ape clambered, chattering and shrieking, about the cornices of the mosques, or clung to the minarets and oriels. From the swarming streets to the banks of the river, there descended innumerable flights of steps leading to bathing places, while the river itself seemed to force a passage with difficulty through the vast fleets of deeply burthened ships that far and wide encountered its surface. Beyond the limits of the city arose, in frequent majestic groups, the palm and the cocoa, with other gigantic and weird trees of vast age. Oh, come back. Where is it? Weird. It is wrong. Unless it's a former spelling, I'd be curious to find out. Beyond the limits of the city arose in frequent majestic groups the palm and the cocoa, with other gigantic and weird trees of vast age. And here and there might be seen a field of rice, the thatched hut of a peasant, a tank, a stray temple, a gypsy camp, or a solitary, graceful maiden taking her way, with a pitcher upon her head, to the banks of the magnificent river. I feel like that should be making her way. You will say now, of course, that I dreamed, but not so. But not so. What I saw, what I heard, what I felt, what I thought, had about it nothing of the unmistakable idiosyncrasy of the dream. All was rigorously self-consistent. At first, doubting that I was really awake, I entered into a series of tests, which soon convinced me that I really was. Now, when one dreams, and in the dream suspects that he dreams, the suspicion never fails to confirm itself, and the sleeper is almost immediately aroused. Thus, Novalis errs not in saying that we are near waking when we dream that we dream. Had the vision occurred to me as I describe it, without my suspecting it as a dream, then a dream it might absolutely have been, but occurring as it did, and suspected and tested as it was, I am forced to class it among other phenomena. In this I am not sure that you are wrong. In this I am not sure that you are wrong. Sure, yes. In this I am not sure that you are wrong, observed Dr. Templeton, but proceed. You arose and descended into the city. I arose, continued Bedloe, regarding the doctor with an air of profound astonishment. I arose, as you say, and descended into the city. On my way, I fell in with an immense populace, crowding through every avenue, all in the same direction, and exhibiting in every action the wildest excitement. Very suddenly, and by some inconceivable impulse, I became intensely imbued with personal interest in what was going on. I seemed to feel that I had an important part to play, without exactly understanding what it was. Against the crowd which environed me, however, I experienced a deep sentiment of animosity. I shrank from amid them, and swiftly by a circuitous path reached and entered the city. Here all was the wildest tumult and contention. A small party of men, clad in garments half Indian, half European, and officered by gentlemen in a uniform partly British, were engaged at great odds with the swarming rabble of the alleys. I joined the weaker party, arming myself with the weapons of a fallen officer, and fighting I knew not whom with the nervous ferocity of despair. We were soon overpowered by numbers and driven to seek refuge in a species of kiosk. Here we barricaded ourselves, and for the present were secure. From a loophole near the summit of the kiosk, I perceived a vast crowd, in furious agitation, surrounding and assaulting a gay palace that overhung the river. Presently, from an upper window of this palace, there descended an effeminate-looking person by means of a string made of the turbans of his attendants. A boat was at hand, in which he escaped to the opposite bank of the river. And now a new object took possession of my soul. I spoke a few hurried but energetic words to my companions, and having succeeded in gaining over a few of them to my purpose, made a frantic sally from the kiosk. We rushed amid the crowd that surrounded it. They retreated at first before us, They rallied, fought madly, and retreated again. In the meantime, we were borne far from the kiosk and became bewildered and entangled among the narrow streets of tall, overhanging houses, into the recesses of which the sun had never been able to shine. To shine. The rabble pressed impetuously upon us, harassing us with their spears, and overwhelming us with flights of arrows. These latter were very remarkable, and resembled in some respects the writhing crease of the Malay. Crease of the Malay. What's spelling of Chris? I don't know what it means. Of the Malay. They were made to imitate the body of a creeping serpent, and were long and black with a poisoned barb. One of them struck me upon the right temple. I reeled and fell, and an instantaneous and dreadful sickness seized me. I struggled. I gasped. I died. You will hardly persist now, said I, smiling, that the whole of your adventure was not a dream. You are not prepared to maintain that you are dead. When I said these words, I of course expected some lively sally from Bedloe in reply. But to my astonishment, he hesitated, trembled, became fearfully pallid, and remained silent. I looked towards Templeton. He sat erect and rigid in his chair. His teeth chattered, and his eyes were staring from their sockets. Proceed, he at length said hoarsely to Bedloe. For many minutes, continued the latter, my sole sentiment, my sole feeling, was that of darkness and nonentity, with the consciousness of death. At length there seemed to pass a violent and sudden shock through my soul, as if of electricity. With it came the sense of elasticity and of light. This latter I felt, not saw. In an instant I seemed to rise from the ground, but I had no bodily, no visible, audible, or palpable presence. The crowd had departed. The tumult had ceased. The city was in comparative repose. Beneath me lay my corpse, with the arrow in my temple, the whole head greatly swollen and disfigured. But all these things I felt, not saw. I took interest in nothing. Even the corpse seemed a matter in which I had no concern. Volition I had none, but appeared to be impelled into motion, and flitted buoyantly out of the city, retracing the circuitous path by which I had entered it. When I had attained that point of the ravine in the mountains at which I had encountered the hyena, I again experienced a shock as of a galvanic battery. The sense of weight, of volition, of substance returned. I became my original self, and bent my steps eagerly homewards. But the past had not lost the vividness of the real, and not now, even for an instant, can I compel my understanding to regard it as a dream. Nor was it, said Templeton, with an air of deep solemnity. Yet it would be difficult to say how otherwise it should be termed. Let us suppose only that the soul of the man of today is upon the verge of some stupendous cycle of discoveries. Let us content ourselves with this supposition. For the rest I have some explanation to make. Here is a watercolor drawing, which I should have shown you before, but which an accountable sentiment of horror has hitherto prevented me from showing. We looked at the picture which he presented. I saw nothing in it of an extraordinary character, but its effect upon Bedloe was prodigious. He nearly fainted as he gazed, and yet it was but a miniature portrait, a miraculously accurate one, to be sure, of his own very remarkable features. At least this was my thought as I regarded it. You will perceive, said Templeton, the date of this picture. It is here scarcely visible in this corner, 1780. In this year was the portrait taken. It is the likeness of a dead friend, a Mr. Oldeb, to whom I became much attached at Calcutta during the administration of Warren Hastings. I was then only 20 years old. When I first saw you, Mr. Bedloe, at Saratoga, it was the miraculous similarity which existed between yourself and the painting which induced me to accost you, to seek your friendship, and to bring about those arrangements which resulted in my becoming your constant companion. In accomplishing this point, I was urged partly, and perhaps principally, by a regretful memory of the deceased, but also in part by an uneasy and not altogether horrorless curiosity respecting yourself. In your detail of the vision which presented itself to you amid the hills, you have described, with the minutest accuracy, the Indian city of Benares upon the Holy River. The riots, the combats, the massacre were the actual events of the insurrection of Chait Singh, which took place in 1780, when Hastings was put in imminent peril of his life. The man escaping by the string of turbans was Chait Singh himself. The party in the kiosk were sepoy and British officers, headed by Hastings. Of this party I was one, and did all I could to prevent the rash and fatal sally of the officer who fell in the crowded alleys by the poisoned arrow of a Bengali. That officer was my dearest friend. It was Oldeb. You will perceive by these manuscripts, here the speaker produced a notebook, in which several pages appeared to have been freshly written, that at the very period in which you fancied these things amid the hills, I was engaged in detailing them upon paper here at home. In about a week after this conversation, the following paragraphs appeared in a Charlottesville paper. No! We have the painful duty of announcing the death of Mr. Augustus Bedloe, a gentleman whose amiable manners, many virtues have long endeared him to the citizens of Charlottesville. Mr. B, for some years past, has been subject to neuralgia, which has often threatened to terminate fatally, but this can be regarded only as the immediate cause of his decease. The proximate cause was one of especial singularity. In an excursion to the Ragged Mountains a few days since, a slight cold and fever were contracted, attended with great determination of blood to the head. To relieve this, Dr. Templeton resorted to topical bleeding. Leeches were applied to the temples. In a fearful brief period, the patient died, when it appeared that, in the jar containing the leeches, had been introduced by accident one of the venomous vermicular sangsus, which are now and then found in the neighboring ponds. This creature fastened itself upon a small artery in the right temple. Its close resemblance to the medicinal leech caused the mistake to be overlooked until too late. N.B. The poisonous sangsu of Charlottesville may always be distinguished from the medicinal leech by its blackness and especially by its writhing or vermicular motions, which very nearly resemble those of a snake. I was speaking with the editor of the paper in question upon the topic of this remarkable accident, when it occurred to me to ask how it happened that the name of the deceased had been given as Bedloe. I presume, said I, you have authority. Oh, yeah, because I noticed that too. It didn't have an E. Okay, I read ahead / oh, shoot. I presume, said I, you have authority for this spelling, but I have always supposed the name to be written with an E at the end. Authority? No, he replied. It is a mere typographical error. The name is Bedloe with an E all the world over, and I never knew it to be spelt otherwise in my life. Then, said I mutteringly, as I turned upon my heel, then indeed has it come to pass that one truth is stranger than any fiction. For Bedloe, without the E, what is it but Oldab conversed? And this man tells me it is a typographical error. Ooh, that was super good. I quite enjoyed that one. Oh, so good. And that's so interesting. Oh, it does. It brings. So consider time. What if we were to consider whether time is wibbly wobbly, timey wimey, for my own lack of a better. So like if it okay, calming myself, focusing. Consider, because how is it that his tale or his death would be so closely formed or reflective of the old one, if time itself was not always all happening at once? Do you know what I'm saying? Oh, I love that so much. And I do. I love coincidence because at some point, oh, wait. I, like God, do not play with dice and do not believe in coincidence to some degree, because at some point, it is no longer coincidence. Like there is the, what is it called? I always forget. Where when you're looking for it, the illusion of where it is, where it is confirming, illusion of confirmation. That's not at all what it is, but confirming your own suppositions only because you're looking for it. But again, at some point, coincidence is no longer coincidence. Oh, so good. So good. Oh, so interesting. Anywho, okay. So that was A Tale of the Ragged Mountains by Edgar Allan Poe. We will move on now to the spectacles, which is apparently a comedic one. The spectacles. Many years ago, it was the fashion to ridicule the idea of love at first sight, but those who think, not less than those who feel deeply, have always advocated its existence. Modern discoveries, indeed, in what may be termed ethical magnetism or magnetes- magnetasthetics, render it probable that the most natural and consequently the truest and most intense of the human affections are those which arise in the heart as if by electric sympathy. In a word, that the brightest and most enduring of the psychal fetters are those which are riveted by a glance. The confession I am about to make will add another to the already almost innumerable instances of the truth of the position. My story requires that I should be somewhat minute. I am still a very young man, not yet 22 years of age. My name at present is a very usual and rather plebeian one, Simpson. I say at present, for it is only lately that I have been so called, having legislatively adopted this surname within the last year in order to receive a large inheritance left me by a distant male relative, Adolphus Simpson, Esquire. The bequest was conditioned upon my taking the name of the testator, the family, not the Christian name, the family, not the Christian name. My Christian name is Napoleon Bonaparte, or more properly, these are my first and middle appellations. I assumed the name Simpson, so Napoleon Bonaparte Simpson. I assumed the name Simpson with some reluctance, as in my true patronym Froissart, Froissart, Froissart. I felt a very pardonable pride, believing that I could trace a descent from the immortal author of the Chronicles. While on the subject of Froissart, my true patronym Froissart. I assumed the name Simpson with some reluctance, as in my true patronym Froissart, I felt a very pardonable pride, believing that I could trace a descent from the immortal author of the Chronicles. While on the subject of names, by the by, I may mention a singular coincidence of sound attending the names of some of my immediate predecessors. My father was a Monsieur Froissart of Paris. His wife, my mother, whom he married at 15, was a Mademoiselle Froissart, eldest daughter of a Froissart the banker, whose wife again being only 16 when married. Hang on. My father was a Monsieur. I'm just gonna say Froissart because Froissart because I feel like I'm not getting the accent correct and it just isn't working. My father was a Monsieur Froissart of Paris. His wife, my mother, whom he married at 15, was a Mademoiselle Froissart, eldest daughter of Froissart the banker, whose wife again, being only 16 when married, was the eldest daughter of one Victor Froissart. Monsieur Froissart, very singularly, had married a lady of similar name, a Mademoiselle Moissart. She, too, was quite a child when married, and her mother also, Madame Moissart, was only 14 when led to the altar. These early marriages are usual in France. Here, however, oh goodness, are Moissart, Voissart, Croissart, and Froissart, all in the direct line of descent. My own name, though, as I say, became Simpson by act of legislature and with so much repugnance on my part that at one period I actually hesitated about accepting the legacy with the useless and annoying proviso attached. As to personal endowments, I am by no means deficient. On the contrary, I believe that I am well made and possess what 9/10 of the world would call a handsome face. In height, I am 5 feet 11. My hair is black and curling, my nose is sufficiently good, my eyes are large and gray, and although in fact they are weak to a very inconvenient degree, still no defect in this regard would be suspected from their appearance. The weakness itself, however, has always much annoyed me, and I have resorted to every remedy, short of wearing glasses. Being youthful and good-looking, I naturally dislike these, and have resolutely refused to employ them. I know nothing indeed which so disfigures the countenance of a young person, or so impresses every feature with an air of demureness, if not altogether of sanctimoniousness and of age. An eyeglass, on the other hand, has a savour of downright foppery and affectation. I have hitherto managed as well as I could without either, but something too much of these merely personal details which, after all, are of little importance. I will content myself with saying, in addition, that my temperament is sanguine, rash, ardent, enthusiastic, and that all my life I have been a devoted admirer of the women. One night last winter, I entered a box at the P Theatre in company with a friend, Mr. Talbot. It was an opera night, and the bills presented a very rare attraction, so that the house was excessively crowded. We were in time, however, to obtain the front seats which had been reserved for us, and into which, with some little difficulty, we elbowed our way. I think there's a lot of French in here, so I apologize. For 2 hours, my companion, who was a musical fanatico, gave his undivided attention to the stage, and in the meantime, I amused myself by observing the audience, which consisted, in chief part, of the very elite of the city. Having satisfied myself upon this point, I was about turning my eyes to the prima donna when they were arrested and riveted by a figure in one of the private boxes which had escaped my observation. If I live 1,000 years, I can never forget the intense emotion with which I regarded this figure. It was that of a female, the most exquisite I had ever beheld. The face was so far turned towards the stage that for some minutes I could not obtain a view of it, but the form was divine. No other word can sufficiently express its magnificent proportion, and even the term divine seems ridiculously feeble as I write it. The magic of a lovely form in woman, the necromancy or necromancy. Ah! Necromancy. The, ne- the magic of a lovely form in woman, the necromancy of female gracefulness, was always a power which I had found it impossible to resist. But here was grace personified, incarnate, the beau ideal of my wildest and most enthusiastic visions. The figure, almost all of which the construction of the box permitted to be seen, was somewhat above the medium height, and nearly approached, without positively reaching, the majestic. Its perfect fullness and tournure were delicious, the head of which only the back was visible. Shoot. I have a theory, which I will twist. Its perfect fullness and curvature were delicious. I will be absolutely honest if I am correct or not at the end. The head of which only the back was visible, rivaled in outline that of the Greek Psyche, and was rather displayed than concealed by an elegant cap of gaze d'Arienne. Uh, let's try French. Oops, oops, oops. By an elegant cap of gaz d'Arienne, so probably a train or something, which put me in mind of the ventum textilum of Apuleius. The right arm hung over the balustrade of the box and thrilled every nerve of my frame with its exquisite symmetry. Its upper portion was draperied by one of the loose open sleeves now in fashion. This extended but little below the elbow. Beneath it was worn an under one of some frail material, close fitting and terminated by a cuff of rich lace, which fell gracefully over the top of the hand, revealing only the delicate fingers, upon one of which sparkled a diamond ring, which I at once saw was of extraordinary value. The admirable roundness of the wrist was well set off by a bracelet which encircled it, and which also was ornamented and clasped by a magnificent aigrette, a headdress consisting of a white egret's feather or other decoration such as a spray of gems. Aigrette. The admirable roundness of the wrist was well set off by a bracelet which encircled it, and which also was ornamented and clasped by a magnificent aigrette of jewels, telling, in words that could not be mistaken, at once of the wealth and fastidious taste of the wearer. I gazed at this queenly apparition for at least half an hour, as if I had been suddenly converted to stone, and during this period I felt the full force and truth of all that has been said or sung concerning love at first sight. My feelings were totally different from any which I had hitherto experienced in the presence of even the most celebrated specimens of female loveliness. An unaccountable, and what I am compelled to consider a magnetic sympathy of soul for soul, seemed to rivet not only my vision, but my whole powers of thought and feeling upon the admirable object before me. I saw, I felt, I knew that I was deeply, madly, irrevocably in love, and this even before seeing the face of the person beloved. Beloved? I was going to say beloved. Then I changed my mind. Person beloved. So intense indeed was the passion that consumed me that I really believe it would have received little, if any, abatement had the features, yet unseen, proved of merely ordinary character. So anomalous is the nature of the only true love, of the love at first sight, and so little really dependent is it upon the external conditions which only seem to create and control it. While I was thus wrapped in admiration of this lovely vision, a sudden disturbance among the audience caused her to turn her head partially towards me, so that I beheld the entire profile of the face. Its beauty even exceeded my anticipations, and yet there was something about it which disappointed me without my being able to tell exactly what it was. I said disappointed, but this is not altogether the word. My sentiments were at once quieted and exalted. They partook less of transport and more of calm enthusiasm, of enthusiastic repose. This state of feeling arose, perhaps, from the Madonna like and matronly air of the face, and yet I at once understood that it could not have arisen entirely from this. There was something else, some mystery which I could not develop, some expression about the countenance which slightly disturbed me while it greatly heightened my interest. In fact, I was just in that condition of mind which, which prepares a young and susceptible man for any act of extravagance. Had the lady been alone, I should undoubtedly have entered her box and accosted her at all hazards. But fortunately, she was attended by two companions, a gentleman and a strikingly beautiful woman, to all appearance a few years younger than herself. I revolved in my mind a thousand schemes by which I might obtain, hereafter, an introduction to the elder lady, or, for the present, at all events, a more distinct view of her beauty. I would have removed my position to one nearer her own, but the crowded state of the theatre rendered this impossible, and the stern decrees of fashion had, of late, imperatively prohibited the use of the opera glass in a case such as this, even had I been so fortunate as to have one with me, but I had not, and was thus in despair. At length I bethought me of applying to my companion. Talbot, I said, you have an opera glass. Let me have it. An opera glass? No. What do you suppose I would be doing with an opera glass? Here he turned impatiently towards the stage. But Talbot, I continued, pulling him by the shoulder, listen to me, will you? Do you see the stage box? There. No, the next. Did you ever behold as lovely a woman? She is very beautiful, no doubt, he said. I wonder who she can be. Why, in the name of all that is angelic, don't you know who she is? Not to know her argues yourself unknown. Ooh, interesting. She is the celebrated Madame Lalande, the beauty of the day par excellence, and the talk of the whole town. Immensely wealthy, too. A widow and a great match, has just arrived from Paris. Do you know her? Yes, I have the honor. Will you introduce me? Assuredly, with the greatest pleasure. When shall it be? Tomorrow at 1 I will call upon you at B's. Very good, and now do hold your tongue, if you can. In this latter respect I was forced to take Talbot's advice, for he remained obstinately deaf to every further question or suggestion, and occupied himself exclusively, for the rest of the evening, with what was transacting upon the stage. In the meantime I kept my eyes riveted on Madame Lalande, and at length had the good fortune to obtain a full front view of her face. It was exquisitely lovely. This, of course, my heart had told me before, even had not Talbot fully satisfied me upon the point. But still the unintelligible something disturbed me. I finally concluded that my senses were impressed by a certain air of gravity, sadness, or, still more properly, of weariness, which took something from the youth and freshness of the countenance, only to endow it with a seraphic tenderness and majesty, and thus, of course, to my enthusiastic and romantic temperament, with an interest tenfold. While I thus feasted my eyes, I perceived at last, to my great trepidation, by an almost imperceptible start on the part of the lady, that she had become suddenly aware of the intensity of my gaze. Still, I was absolutely fascinated, and could not withdraw it, even for an instant. She turned aside her face, and again I saw only the chiseled contour of the back portion of the head. After some minutes, as if urged by curiosity to see if I was still looking, she gradually brought her face again around, and again encountered my burning gaze. Her large dark eyes fell instantly, and a deep blush mantled her cheek. But what was my astonishment at perceiving that she not only did not a second time avert her head, but that she actually took from her girdle a double eyeglass, elevated it, adjusted it, and then regarded me through it, intently and deliberately, for the space of several minutes. Had a thunderbolt fallen at my feet, I could not have been more thoroughly astounded. Astounded only, not offended or disgusted in the slightest degree, although an action so bold in any other woman would have been likely to offend or disgust. But the whole thing was done with so much quietude, so much nonchalance, so much repose, with so evident an air of the highest breeding, in short, that nothing of mere effrontery was perceptible, and my sole sentiments were those of admiration and surprise. I observed that, upon her first elevation of the glass, she had seemed satisfied with a momentary inspection of my person, and was withdrawing the instrument, when, as if struck by a second thought, she resumed it, and so continued to regard me with fixed attention for the space of several minutes. For 5 minutes, at the very least, I am sure. This action, so remarkable in an American theater, attracted very general observation, and gave rise to an indefinite movement, or buzz, among the audience, which for a moment filled me with confusion, but produced no visible effect upon the countenance of Madame Lalande. Having satisfied her curiosity, if such it was, she dropped the glass and quietly gave her attention again to the stage, her profile now being turned toward myself as before. I continued to watch her unremittingly, although I was fully conscious of my rudeness in so doing. Presently I saw the head slowly and slightly change its position, and soon I became convinced that the lady, while pretending to look at the stage, was in fact attentively regarding myself. It is needless to say what effect this conduct, on the part of so fascinating a woman, had upon my excitable mind. Having thus scrutinized me for perhaps a quarter of an hour, the fair object of my passion addressed the gentleman who attended her, and while she spoke, I saw distinctly, by the glances of both, that the conversation had reference to myself. Upon its conclusion, Madame Lalande again turned towards the stage, and for a few minutes seemed absorbed in the performances. At the expiration of this period, however, I was thrown into an extremity of agitation by seeing her unfold for the second time the eyeglass which hung at her side, fully confront me as before, and disregarding the renewed buzz of the audience, survey me from head to foot with the same miraculous composure which had previously so delighted and confounded my soul. This extraordinary behavior, by throwing me into a perfect fever of excitement, into an absolute delirium of love, served rather to embolden than to disconcert me. In the mad intensity of my devotion, I forgot everything but the presence and the majestic loveliness of the vision which confronted my gaze. Watching my opportunity, when I thought the audience were fully engaged with the opera, I at length caught the eyes of Madame Lalande, and upon the instant made a slight but unmistakable bow. She blushed very deeply, then averted her eyes, then slowly and cautiously looked around, apparently to see if my rash action had been noticed, then leaned over towards the gentleman who sat by her side. I now felt a burning sense of the impropriety I had committed, and expected nothing less than instant exposure, while a vision of pistols upon the morrow floated rapidly and uncomfortably through my brain. I was greatly and immediately relieved, however, when I saw the lady merely hand the gentleman a playbill without speaking. But the reader may form some feeble conception of my astonishment, of my profound amazement, my delirious bewilderment of heart and soul, when instantly afterwards, having again glanced furtively around, she allowed her bright eyes to settle fully and steadily upon my own, and then, with a faint smile, disclosing a bright line of her pearly teeth, made two distinct, pointed, and unequivocal affirmative inclinations of the head. It is useless, of course, to dwell upon my joy, upon my transport, upon my illimitable ecstasy of heart. If ever man was mad with excess of happiness, it was myself at that moment. I loved, I loved. This was my first love, so I felt it to be. It was love supreme, indescribable. It was love at first sight, and at first sight, too, it had been appreciated and returned. Yes, returned. How and why should I doubt it for an instant? What other construction could I possibly put upon such conduct on the part of a lady so beautiful, so wealthy, evidently so accomplished, of so high breeding, of so lofty a position in society, in every regard so entirely respectable, as I felt assured was Madame Lalande? Yes, she loved me. She returned the enthusiasm of my love with an enthusiasm as blind, as uncompromising, as uncalculating, as abandoned, and as utterly unabounded as my own. These delicious fancies and reflections, however, were now interrupted by the falling of the drop curtain. The audience arose, and the usual tumult immediately supervened. Quitting Talbot abruptly, I made every effort to force my way into closer proximity with Madame Lalande. Having failed in this on account of the crowd, I at length gave up the chase and bent my steps homewards, consoling myself. Hang on, sorry. Gave up the chase, bent my steps homewards, consoling myself for my disappointment in not having been able to touch even the hem of her robe by the reflection that I should be introduced by Talbot in due form upon the morrow. This morrow at last came, that is to say, a day finally dawned upon a long and weary night of impatience, and then the hours until 1 were snail-paced, dreary, and innumerable. But even Stamboul, it is said, shall have an end, and there came an end to this long delay. The clock struck. As the last echo ceased, I stepped into B's and inquired for Talbot. "Out," said the footman. Talbot's own. "Out," I replied, staggering back half a dozen paces. "Let me tell you, my fine fellow, that this thing is thoroughly impossible and impracticable. Mr. Talbot is not out. What do you mean?" "Nothing, sir, only Mr. Talbot is not in. That's all. He rode over to S immediately after breakfast and left word that he would not be in town again for a week." I stood petrified with horror and rage. I endeavored to reply, but my tongue refused its office. At length I turned on my heel, livid with wrath, and inwardly consigning the whole tribe of the Talbots to the innermost regions of Erebus. It was evident that my considerate friend, Il Fanatico, had quite forgotten his appointment with myself, had forgotten it as soon as it was made. At no time was he a very scrupulous man of his word. There was no help for it, so smothering my vexation as well as I could, I strolled moodily up the street, propounding futile inquiries about Madame Lalande to every male acquaintance I met. By report she was known, I found, to all, to many by sight, but she had been in town only a few weeks, and there were very few, therefore, who claimed her personal acquaintance. These few, being still comparatively strangers, could not or would not take the liberty of introducing me through the formality of a morning call. While I stood thus, in despair, conversing with a trio of friends, upon the all-absorbing subject of my heart, it so happened that the subject itself passed by. "As I live, there she is," cried one. "Surpassingly beautiful," exclaimed a second. "An angel upon earth," ejaculated a third. I looked, and in an open carriage which approached us, passing slowly down the street, sat the enchanting vision of the opera, accompanied by the younger lady who had occupied a portion of her box. "Her companion also wears remarkably well," said the one of my trio who had spoken first. "Astonishingly," said the second. "Still quite a brilliant air, but art will do wonders. Upon my word, she looks better than she did at Paris 5 years ago. A beautiful woman still. Don't you think so, Froissart? Simpson, I mean." "Still," said I, "and why shouldn't she be? But compared with her friend, she is as a rushlight to the evening star, a glowworm to Antares." "Ha ha ha! Why, Simpson, you have an astonishing tact at making discoveries. Original ones, I mean." And here we separated, while one of the trio began humming a gay vaudeville, of which I caught only the lines, "Ninon, ninon, ninon, abba, abba, ninon, du l'enclos," and nothing. Ow, ow. During this little scene, however, one thing had served greatly to console me, although it fed the passion by which I was consumed. As the carriage of Madame Lalande rolled by our group, I had observed that she recognized me, and more than this, she had blessed me by the most seraphic of all imaginable smiles, with no equivocal mark of the recognition. As for an introduction, I was obliged to abandon all hope of it until such time as Talbot should think proper to return from the country. In the meantime, I perseveringly frequented every reputable place of public amusement, and at length, at the theatre where I first saw her, I had the supreme bliss of meeting her and of exchanging glances with her once again. This did not occur, however, until the lapse of a fortnight. Every day in the interim I had inquired for Talbot at his hotel, and every day had been thrown into a spasm of wrath by the everlasting "not come home yet" of his footman. Upon the evening in question, therefore, I was in a condition little short of madness. Madame Lalande, I had been told, was a Parisian, had lately arrived from Paris. Might she not suddenly return before Talbot came back, and might she not be thus lost to me forever? The thought was too terrible to bear. Since my future happiness was at issue, I resolved to act with a manly decision. In a word, upon the breaking up of the play, I traced the lady to her residence, noted the address, and the next morning sent her a full and elaborate letter in which I poured out my whole heart. I spoke boldly, freely. In a word, I spoke with passion. I concealed nothing, nothing even of my weakness. I alluded to the romantic circumstances of our first meeting, even to the glances which had passed between us. I went so far as to say that I felt assured of her love, while I offered this assurance and my own intensity of devotion as two excuses for my otherwise unpardonable conduct. As a third, I spoke of my fear that she might quit the city before I could have the opportunity of a formal introduction. I concluded the most wildly enthusiastic epistle ever penned, with a frank declaration of my worldly circumstances, of my affluence, and with an offer of my heart and of my hand. In an agony of expectation, I awaited the reply. After what seemed the lapse of a century, it came. Yes, actually came. Romantic as all this, may appear. Get away. Yes, actually came. Romantic as all this may appear, I really received a letter from Madame Lalande, the beautiful, the wealthy. Sorry, Romantic as all this may appear, I really received a letter from Madame Lalande, the beautiful, the wealthy, the idolized Madame Lalande. Her eyes, her magnificent eyes, had not belied her noble heart. Like a true Frenchwoman, as she was, she had obeyed the frank dictates of her reason, the generous impulses of her nature. Despising the conventional pruderies of the world, she had not scorned my proposals. She had not sheltered herself in silence. She had not returned my letter unopened. She had even sent me, in reply, one penned by her own exquisite fingers. It ran thus: Monsieur Simpson will pardon me for not composing the beautiful tongue of his Oh God, is this will part? It's supposed to be in a French accent. Oh no. Okay. Oh, Monsieur Simpson will pardon me for not composing a beautiful something of his country so well as I might. It is only of late that I am arrived and have not yet had an opportunity to study. Study, étudier. I actually can get this one probably. To study it. Oh, with this apology for the manière, for the way, I will now say that what? Monsieur Simpson has guessed what is too true. Need I say any more? Exclamation. Am I not ready speaking? Am I not already speaking too much? Eugenie Lalande. Oh no. Sorry. Um, This noble spirited note I kissed a million times, and committed no doubt on its account 1,000 other extravagances that have now escaped my memory. Still Talbot would not return. Alas, could he have formed even the vaguest idea. Oh, sorry. Alas, could he have formed even the vaguest idea of the suffering his absence occasioned his friend? Would not his sympathizing nature have flown immediately to my relief? Still, however, he came not. I wrote. He replied. He was detained by urgent business, but would shortly return. He begged me not to be impatient, to moderate my transports, to read soothing books, to drink nothing stronger than hock, and to bring the consolations of philosophy to my aid. The fool! If he could not come himself, why, in the name of everything rational, could he not have enclosed me a letter of presentation? I wrote again, entreating him to forward one forthwith. My letter was returned by that footman with the following endorsement in pencil. The scoundrel had joined his master in the country. Oh my gosh. Left S yesterday for parts unknown. Did not say where or when be back, so thought best to return letter, knowing your handwriting, and as how you is always more or less in a hurry. Yours sincerely, Stubbs. After this, it is needless to say that I devoted to the infernal deities both master and valet, but there was little use in anger, and no consolation at all in complaint. But I had yet a resource left, in my constitutional audacity. Hitherto it had served me well, and I now resolved to make it avail me to the end. Besides, after the correspondence which had passed between us, what act of mere informality could I commit, within bounds, that ought to be regarded as indecorous by Madame Lalande? Since the affair of the letter, I had been in the habit of watching her house, and thus discovered that, about twilight, it was her custom to promenade, attended only by a negro in livery, in a public square overlooked by her windows. Here, amid the luxuriant and shadowing groves, in the grey gloom of a sweet midsummer evening, I observed my opportunity and accosted her. The better to deceive the servant in attendance, I did this with the assured air of an old and familiar acquaintance. With a presence of mind truly Parisian, she took the cue at once, and to greet me held out the most bewitchingly little of hands. The valet at once fell into the rear, and now, with hearts full to overflowing, we discoursed long and unreservedly of our love. As Madame Lalande spoke English even less fluently than she wrote it, our conversation was necessarily in French. In this sweet tongue, so adapted to passion, I gave loose to the impetuous enthusiasm of my nature, and with all the eloquence I could command, besought her consent to an immediate marriage. At this impatience, she smiled. She urged the old story of decorum, that bugbear which deters so many from bliss until the opportunity for bliss has forever gone by. I had most imprudently made it known among my friends, she observed, that I desired her acquaintance, thus that I did not possess it. Thus again there was no possibility of concealing the date of our first knowledge of each other. And then she adverted, with a blush, to the extreme recency of this date. To wed immediately would be improper, would be indecorous, would be outre, would be outre. All this she said with a charming air of naivete, which enraptured while it grieved and convinced me. She went even so far as to accuse me, laughingly, of rashness, of imprudence. She bade me remember that I really even knew not who she was, what were her prospects, her connections, her standing in society. She begged me, but with a sigh, to reconsider my proposal, and termed my love an infatuation, a will-o'-the-wisp, a fancy or fantasy of the moment, a baseless and unstable creation, rather of the imagination than of the heart. These things she uttered as the shadows of the sweet twilight gathered darkly and more darkly around us, and then, with a gentle pressure of her fairy-like hand, overthrew in a single sweet instant all the argumentative fabric she had reared. I replied as best I could, as only a true lover can. I spoke at length and perseveringly of my devotion, of my passion, of her exceeding beauty, and of my own enthusiastic admiration. In conclusion, I dwelt with a convincing energy upon the perils that encompass the course of love, that course of true love that never did run smooth, and thus deduced the manifest danger of rendering that course unnecessarily long. This latter argument seemed finally to soften the rigor of her determination. She relented, but there was yet an obstacle. Which she felt assured I had not properly considered. This was a delicate point, for a woman to urge, especially so. In mentioning it, she saw that she must make a sacrifice of her feelings. Still, for me, every sacrifice should be made. She alluded to the topic of age. Was I fully aware of the discrepancy between us, that the age of the husband should surpass by a few years, even by 15 or 20, the age of the wife, was regarded by the world as admissible, and indeed as even proper, but she had always entertained the belief that the years of the wife should never exceed in number those of the husband. A discrepancy of this unnatural kind gave rise too frequently, alas, to a life of unhappiness. Now she was aware that my own age did not exceed 22, and I, on the contrary, perhaps was not aware that the years of my Eugenie extended very considerably beyond that sum. About all this there was a nobility of soul, a dignity of candor which delighted, which enchanted me, which eternally riveted my chains. I could scarcely restrain the excessive transport which possessed me. My sweetest Eugenie, I cried, what is all this about which you are discoursing? Your years surpass in some measure my own. But what then? The customs of the world are so many conventional follies. To those who love as ourselves, in what respect differs a year from an hour? I am 22, you say. Granted, indeed, you may as well call me at once 23. Now you yourself, my dearest Eugenie, can have numbered no more than, no more than, than, than. Here I paused for an instant, in the expectation that Madame Lalande would interrupt me by supplying her true age. But a Frenchwoman is seldom direct, and has always, by way of answer to an embarrassing query, some little practical reply of her own. In the present instance, Eugenie, who for a few moments past had seemed to be searching for something in her bosom, at length let fall upon the grass a miniature, which I immediately picked up and presented to her. "Keep it," she said, with one of her most ravishing smiles. "Keep it for my sake, for the sake of her whom it too flatteringly represents. Besides, upon the back of the trinket you may discover, perhaps, the very information you seem to desire. It is now, to be sure, growing rather dark, but you can examine it at your leisure, in the morning. In the meantime, you shall be my escort home tonight. My friends are about holding a little musical levee. I can promise you, too, some good singing. We French are not nearly so punctilious as you Americans, and I shall have no difficulty in smuggling you in the character of an old acquaintance." With this she took my arm, and I attended her home. The mansion was quite a fine one, and I believe, furnished in good taste. Of this latter point, however, I am scarcely qualified to judge, for it was just dark as we arrived, and in American mansions of the better sort, Lights seldom, during the heat of summer, make their appearance at this, the most pleasant period of the day. In about an hour after my arrival, to be sure, a single shaded solar lamp was lit in the principal drawing room. Sorry. And this apartment, I could thus see, was arranged with unusual good taste and even splendor. But two other rooms of the suite, and in which the company chiefly assembled, remained, during the whole evening, in a very agreeable shadow. This is a well-conceived custom, giving the party at least a choice of light or shade, and one which our friends over the water could not do better than immediately adopt. The evening thus spent was unquestionably the most delicious of my life. Madame Lalande had not overrated the musical abilities of her friends, and the singing I here heard I had never heard excelled in any private circle out of Vienna. The instrumental performers were many and of superior talents. The vocalists were chiefly ladies, and no individual sang less than well. At length, upon a peremptory call from Madame Lalande, she arose at once, without affectation or demur, from the chaise longue upon which she had sate by my side, and, accompanied by one or two gentlemen and her female friend of the opera, repaired to the piano in the main drawing-room. I would have escorted her myself, but felt that, under these circumstances of my introduction to the house, I had better remain unobserved where I was. I was thus deprived of the pleasure of seeing, although not of hearing, her sing. The impression she produced upon the company seemed electrical, but the effect upon myself was something even more. I know not how adequately to describe it. It arose in part, no doubt, from the sentiment of love with which I was imbued, but chiefly from my conviction of the extreme sensibility of the singer. It is beyond the reach of art to endow either air or recitative, 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 recitative. It is beyond the reach of art to endow either air or recitative with more impassioned expression than was hers. Her utterance of the romance in Otello, the tone with which she gave the words sul mio sasso on my stone in the Cappelletti, is ringing in my memory yet. Her lower tones were absolutely miraculous. Her voice embraced three complete octaves, extending from the contralto D to the D upper soprano, and, though sufficiently powerful to have filled the San Carlos, executed with the minutest precision every difficulty of vocal composition. Ascending and descending scales, cadences, or fiorituri, flowering, musical term. In the finale of the Sonnambula, she brought about a most remarkable effect at the words, "Shoot, human thought to the contentment I am full." Here, in imitation of Malibran, she modified the original phase, of Bellini so as to let her voice descend to the tenor G, when by a rapid transition she struck the G above the treble stave, springing over an interval of 2 octaves. Upon rising from the piano after these miracles of vocal execution, she resumed her seat by my side, when I expressed to her in terms of the deepest enthusiasm my delight at her performance. Of my surprise I said nothing, and yet was I most unfeignedly surprised, for a certain feebleness, or rather a certain tremulous indecision of voice, in ordinary conversation, had prepared me to anticipate that, in singing, she would not acquit herself with any remarkable ability. Our conversation was now long, earnest, uninterrupted, and totally unreserved. She made me relate many of the earlier passages of my life, and listened with breathless attention to every word of the narrative. I concealed nothing. I felt that I had a right to conceal nothing from her confiding affection. Encouraged by her candor upon the delicate point of her age, I entered with perfect frankness, not only into a detail of my many minor vices, but made full confession of those moral and even of those physical infirmities, the disclosure of which, in demanding so much higher a degree of courage, is so much surer an evidence of love. I touched upon my college indiscretions, upon my extravagances, upon my carousals, upon my debts, upon my flirtations. I even went so far as to speak of a slightly hectic cough with which, at one time, I had been troubled, of a chronic rheumatism, of a twinge of hereditary gout, and in conclusion of the disagreeable and inconvenient, but hitherto carefully concealed, weakness of my eyes. Upon this latter point, said Madame Lalande laughingly, you have been surely injudicious in coming to confession, for without the confession I take it for granted that no one would have accused you of the crime. By the by, she continued, have you any recollection? And here I fancied that a blush, even through the gloom of the apartment, became distinctly visible upon her cheek. Have you any recollection, mon cher ami, of this little ocular assistant which now depends from my neck? As she spoke, she twirled in her fingers the identical double eyeglass which had so overwhelmed me with confusion at the opera. Full well, alas, do I remember it, I exclaimed, pressing passionately the delicate hand which offered the glasses for my inspection. They formed a complex and magnificent toy, richly chased and filigreed and gleaming with jewels, which even in the deficient light I could not help perceiving were of high value. Eh bien, mon ami, she resumed with a certain empressement of manner that rather surprised me. Eh bien, ami, mon ami, you have earnestly besought of me a favor which you have been pleased to denominate priceless. You have demanded of me my hand upon the morrow. Should I yield to your entreaties, and I may add to the pleadings of my own bosom, would I not be entitled to demand of you a very little boon in return? Name it, I exclaimed with an energy that had nearly drawn upon us the observation of the company, and restrained by their presence alone from throwing myself impetuously at her feet. Name it, my beloved, my Eugenie, my own, name it, but alas, it is already yielded ere named. You shall conquer then, mon ami, said she, for the sake of the Eugenie, whom you love. This little weakness which you have last confessed, this weakness more moral than physical, and which, let me assure you, is so unbecoming the nobility of your real nature, so inconsistent with the candor of your usual character, and which, if permitted farther control, will assuredly involve you, sooner or later, in some very disagreeable scrape. You shall conquer, for my sake, this affectation which leads you, as you yourself acknowledge, to the tacit or implied denial of your infirmity of vision. For this infirmity you virtually deny in refusing to employ the customary means for its relief. You will understand me to say, then, that I wish you to wear spectacles. Ah, hush! You have already consented to wear them for my sake. You shall accept the little toy which I now hold in my hand, and which, though admirable as an aid to vision, is really of no very immense value as a gem. You perceive that, by a trifling modification thus or thus, it can be adapted to the eyes in the form of spectacles, or worn in the waistcoat pocket as an eyeglass. It is in the former mode, however, and habitually, that you have already consented to wear it for my sake. This request, must I confess it, confused me in no little degree, but the condition with which it was coupled rendered hesitation, of course, a matter altogether out of the question. It is done, I cried with all the enthusiasm that I could muster at the moment. It is done, it is most cheerfully agreed. I sacrifice every feeling for your sake. Tonight I wear this dear eyeglass, as an eyeglass, and upon my heart, but with the earliest dawn of that morning which gives me the pleasure of calling you wife, I will place it upon my nose, and there wear it ever afterwards, in the less romantic and less fashionable, but certainly in the more serviceable form which you desire. Our conversation now turned upon the details of our arrangements for the morrow. Talbot, I learned from my betrothed, had just arrived in town. I was to see him at once and procure a carriage. The soirée would scarcely break up before 2, and by this hour the vehicle was to be at the door, when in the confusion occasioned by the departure of the company, Madame L. could easily enter it unobserved. We were then to call at the house of a clergyman who would be in waiting, there be married, drop Talbot, and proceed on a short tour to the east, leaving the fashionable world at home, to make whatever comments upon the matter it thought best. Having planned all this, I immediately took leave and went in search of Talbot, but on the way I could not refrain from stepping into a hotel for the purpose of inspecting the miniature, and this I did by the powerful aid of the glasses. The countenance was a surpassingly beautiful one, those large, luminous eyes, that proud Grecian nose, those dark, luxuriant curls. Ah, said I exultingly to myself, this is indeed the speaking image of my beloved. I turned the reverse and discovered the words Eugenie Lalande, aged 27 years and 7 months. She's so old! I found Talbot at home and proceeded at once to acquaint him with my good fortune. He professed excessive astonishment, of course, but congratulated me most cordially, and proffered every assistance in his power. In a word, we carried out our arrangement to the letter. and at 2 in the morning, just 10 minutes after the ceremony, I found myself in a close carriage with Madame Lalande, with Mrs. Simpson, I should say, and driving at a great rate out of town, in a direction northeast by north, half north. It had been determined for us by Talbot that, as we were to be up all night, we should make our first stop at C, a village about 20 miles from the city, and there get an early breakfast and some repose, before proceeding upon our route. At 4 precisely, therefore, the carriage drew up at the door of the principal inn. I handed my adored wife out, and ordered breakfast forthwith. In the meantime, we were shown into a small parlor, and sat down. It was now nearly, if not altogether, daylight, and as I gazed, enraptured at the angel by my side, the singular idea came, all at once, into my head, that this was really the very first moment since my acquaintance with the celebrated loveliness of Madame Lalande, that I had enjoyed a near inspection of that loveliness by daylight at all. And now, mon ami, said she, taking my hand, and so interrupting this train of reflection, and now, mon cher ami, since we are indissolubly one, since I have yielded to your passionate entreaties and performed my portion of our agreement, I presume you have not forgotten that you also have a little favor to bestow, a little promise which it is your intention to keep. Ah, let me see, let me remember. Yes, full easily do I call to mind the precise words of the dear promise you made to Eugenie last night. Listen, you spoke thus. It is done, it is most cheerfully agreed. I sacrifice every feeling for your sake. Tonight I wear this dear eyeglass as an eyeglass, and upon my heart, but with the earliest dawn of that morning which gives me the privilege of calling you wife, I will place it upon my nose, and there wear it ever afterwards, in the less romantic and less fashionable, but certainly in the more serviceable form which you desire. These were the exact words, my beloved husband, were they not? They were, I said. You have an excellent memory, and assuredly, my beautiful Eugenie, there is no disposition on my part to evade the performance of the trivial promise they imply. See, behold, they are becoming, rather, are they not? And here, having arranged the glasses in the ordinary form of spectacles, I applied them gingerly in their proper position, while Madame Simpson, adjusting her cap and folding her arms, sat bolt upright in her chair in a somewhat stiff and prim, and indeed in a somewhat undignified position. Goodness gracious me, I exclaimed, almost at the very instant that the rim of the spectacles had settled upon my nose. My goodness gracious me, what can be the matter with these glasses? And taking them quickly off, I wiped them carefully with a silk handkerchief, and adjusted them again. But if, in the first instance, there had occurred something which occasioned me surprise, in the second this surprise became elevated into astonishment, and this astonishment was profound, was extreme, indeed I may say it was horrific. What in the name of everything hideous did this mean? Could I believe my eyes? Could I? That was the question. Was that rouge? And were those wrinkles upon the visage of Eugenie Lalande? And oh, Jupiter, and every one of the gods and goddesses, little and big, what, what, what had become of her teeth? I dashed the spectacles violently to the ground, and leaping to my feet, stood erect in the middle of the floor, confronting Mrs. Simpson, with my arms set akimbo, and grinning and foaming, but at the same time utterly speechless and helpless with terror and with rage. Now I have already said that Madame Eugenie Lalande, that is to say Simpson, spoke the English language but very little better than she wrote it. And for this reason she very properly never attempted to speak it upon ordinary occasions, but rage will carry a lady to any extreme, and in the present case it carried Mrs. Simpson to the very extraordinary extreme of attempting to hold a conversation in a tongue that she did not altogether understand. "Well, monsieur," said she, "oh my gosh!" "Well, monsieur," said she, after surveying me in great apparent astonishment for some moments. "Well, monsieur, and what then? What is the matter now? Is it the dance of the Saint Vitus that you have? If not, if you don't like me, what for why by the pig in the poke?" "You wretch," said I, catching my breath, you villainous old hag! Hag, old, me not so very old, after all, me not one single day more than 82? 82, I ejaculated, staggering to the wall. 8,200,000 baboons! Okay, that's a great exclamation. The miniature said 27 years and 7 months. Oops, shoot. The miniature said 27 years and 7 months. To be sure, that is so, very true, but then the portrait has been taken for these 55 years. When I go marry my second husband, Monsieur Lalande, at that time I had the portrait taken for my daughter by my first husband, Monsieur Moissart! Moissart, said I. Yes, Moissart, said she, mimicking my pronunciation, which, to speak the truth, was none of the best. And what then? What do you know about the Moissart? Nothing, you old fright. I know nothing about him at all. Only I had an ancestor of that name once upon a time. That name, and what you have for something to that name. This very good name, and so is Voissart. That is a very good name too. My daughter, Mademoiselle Moissart, she married one Monsieur Voissart, and the name is both very respectable names. Moissart, I exclaimed, and Voissart? Why, what is it you mean? What do I mean? I mean Moissart and Voissart, and for the matter of that, I mean Croissart and Froissart, too, if I only think proper to mean it. Oh, the twist. The scandal. I had an inkling that that was going to happen. If I only think proper to mean it. My daughter's daughter, Mademoiselle Voissart, she married one Monsieur Croissart, and then again, my daughter's granddaughter, Mademoiselle Croissart, she married one Monsieur Froissart. And I suppose you say that that is not one very respectable name. Froissart, said I, beginning to faint. Why, surely you don't say Moissart and Froissart and Croissart and Froissart. Yes, she replied, leaning fully back in her chair and stretching out her lower limbs at great length. Yes, Moissart and Voissart and Croissart and Froissart. But Monsieur Froissart, he was one very big, that you would call a fool. He is one very great big dunce like yourself, for he left the beautiful France to come to this stupid America, and when he got here, he went and have one very very stupid son. So I hear, though I have not yet had the pleasure to meet with him, neither me nor my companion, de Madame Stephanie Lalande. He is named de Napoleon Bonaparte Froissart, and I suppose you say that that, too, is not one very respectable name. Either the length or the nature of this speech had the effect of working up Mrs. Simpson into a very extraordinary passion indeed, and as she made an end of it, with great labor she jumped up from her chair like somebody bewitched, dropping upon the floor an entire universe of bustle as she jumped. Once upon her feet, she gnashed her gums, brandished her arms, rolled up her sleeves, shook her fist in my face, and concluded the performance by tearing the cap from her head, and with it an immense wig of the most valuable and beautiful black hair, the whole of which she dashed upon the ground with a yell, and there trampled and danced a fandango upon it, in an absolute ecstasy and agony of rage. Meantime I sank aghast into the chair which she had vacated. Moissart and Voissart, I repeated thoughtfully as she cut one of her pigeon wings, and Croissart and Froissart as she completed another. Moissart and Voissart and Croissart and Napoleon Bonaparte Froissart. Why, you ineffable old serpent, that's me! That's me, do you hear? That's me! Here I screamed at the top of my voice. That's me! I am Napoleon Bonaparte Froissart, and if I haven't married my great-great-grandmother, I wish I may be everlastingly confounded. Madame Eugenie Lalande, quasi-Simpson, formerly Moissart, was in sober fact my great-great-grandmother. In her youth she had been beautiful, and even at 82 retained the majestic height, the sculptural contour of head, the fine eyes, and the Grecian nose of her girlhood. By the aid of these, of pearl powder, of rouge, of false hair, false teeth, and false tournure, as well as of the most skilful modistes of Paris, she contrived to hold a respectable footing among the beauties en peu passé of the French metropolis. In this respect, indeed, she might have been regarded as little less than the equal of the celebrated Ninon de l'Enclos. She was immensely wealthy, and being left for the second time a widow without children, she bethought herself of my existence in America, and for the purpose of making me her heir, paid a visit to the United States in company with a distant and exceedingly lovely relative of her second husband's, a Madame Stephanie Lalande. At the opera, my great-great-grandmother's attention was arrested by my notice, and upon surveying me through her eyeglass, she was struck with a certain family resemblance to herself. Thus interested in knowing that the heir she sought was actually in the city, she made inquiries of her party respecting me. The gentleman who attended her knew my person and told her who I was. The information thus obtained induced her to renew her scrutiny, and this scrutiny it was which so emboldened me that I behaved in the absurd manner already detailed. She returned my bow, however, under the impression that, by some odd accident, I had discovered her identity. When deceived by my weakness of vision and the arts of the toilet, in respect to the age and charms of the strange lady, I demanded so enthusiastically of Talbot who she was, he concluded that I meant the younger beauty as a matter of course, and so informed me with perfect truth that she was the celebrated widow, Madame Lalande. In the street next morning, my great-great-grandmother encountered Talbot, an old Parisian acquaintance, and the conversation very naturally turned upon myself. My deficiencies of vision were then explained, for these were notorious, although I was entirely ignorant of their notoriety, and my good old relative discovered, much to her chagrin, that she had been deceived in supposing me aware of her identity, and that I had been merely making a fool of myself in making open love in a theater to an old woman unknown. By way of punishing me for this imprudence, she concocted with Talbot a plot. He purposely kept out of my way to avoid giving me the introduction. My street inquiries about the lovely widow, Madame Lalande, were supposed to refer to the younger lady, of course, and thus the conversation with the three gentlemen whom I encountered shortly after leaving Talbot's hotel will be easily explained, as also their allusion to Ninon de l'Enclos. I had no opportunity of seeing Madame Lalande closely during daylight, and at her musical soiree, my silly weakness in refusing the aid of glasses effectually prevented me from making a discovery of her age. When Madame Lalande was called upon to sing, the younger lady was intended, and it was she who arose to obey the call. My great-great-grandmother, to further the deception, arising at the same moment and accompanying her to the piano in the main drawing-room. Had I decided upon escorting her thither, it had been her design to suggest the propriety of my remaining where I was. But my own prudential views rendered this unnecessary. The songs which I so much admired, and which so confirmed my impression of the youth of my mistress, were executed by Madame Stephanie Lalande. The eyeglass was presented by way of adding a reproof to the hoax, a sting to the epigram of the deception. Its presentation afforded an opportunity for the lecture upon affectation, with which I was so especially edified. It is almost superfluous to add that the glasses of the instrument, as worn by the old lady, had been exchanged by her for a pair better adapted to my years. They suited me, in fact, to a T. Oh my gosh. The clergyman who merely pretended to tie the fatal knot was a boon companion of Talbot's and no priest. He was an excellent whip, however, and having doffed his cassock to put on a greatcoat, he drove the hack which conveyed the happy couple out of town. Talbot took a seat at his side. The two scoundrels were thus in at the death, and through a half-open window of the back parlor of the inn, amused themselves in grinning at the denouement of the drama. I believe I shall be forced to call them both out. Nevertheless, I am not the husband of my great-great-grandmother, and this is a reflection which affords me infinite relief. But I am the husband of Madame Lalande, of Madame Stephanie Lalande, with whom my good old relative, besides making me her sole heir when she dies, if she ever does, has been at the trouble of concocting me a match. In conclusion, I am done forever with billet doux, and am never to be met without spectacles. Ah, I am done forever with billet. Isn't that 2 tickets? Soft billet? I don't know. And I'm never to be met without spectacles. Oh, that was fantastic. Excellent, excellently executed. Oh my gosh, that was fantastic. I enjoyed it very much. Very comedic. I was thinking that she was going to, at the beginning, I was thinking she was going to be wearing spectacles and he was going to be so disgusted by his love at first sight. But alas, it was far better than I even anticipated. And this one is going to have a lot of French in it, so I apologize in advance. Oof. I think this may be the last one I'll be able to do. Perhaps. I might be able to get through the oblong box. but it might cut a bit close. All right, the Duke de l'Omelette. I believe this one. Yes, I believe this one is also comedic. So I think I was planning on getting through the oblong box. So this is the Duke de l'Omelette, the Duke of the Omelette. Ah, sorry. All right, the de l'Omelette. That was The Spectacles by Edgar Allan Poe. Fantastic. The Duke de l'Omelette. And stepped at once into a cooler clime. Cowper. One sec. I just want to quick check things, make sure they're working well. I think so, apart from the fact that it doesn't say that I'm on at all. I'll figure it out later. We shall continue reading, if it is only me, myself, and I. The Duke de l'Omelette, and stepped at once into a cooler clime. Cowper. Keats fell by a criticism. Who was it died of the Andromache? Montfleury, the author of the Parnasse Reformé, which makes him speak in Hades. The man something who would want something, this something. I am dead. The man, therefore, who would like to have been, whose death I am following, does not ask whether it was done with je t'aimerai? I don't know. Or with something or something else, but he hears that it was with Andromache. Sure, we'll hopefully understand this one. Ignoble souls. De l'Omelette perished of an ortolan. The history in is brief. Assist me, spirit of Apicius. I apologize in advance for this disaster. A golden cage bore the little winged wanderer, enamored, melting, indolent to the Chaussée d'Antin, from its home in far Peru. From its queenly possessor, La Bellissima, to the Duke de l'Omelette, 6 peers of the empire conveyed the happy bird. That night the Duke was to sup alone. In the privacy of his bureau, he reclined languidly on that ottoman for which he sacrificed his loyalty in outbidding his king, the notorious Ottoman of Cadet. He buries his face in the pillow. The clock strikes. Unable to restrain his feelings, his grace swallows an olive. At this moment, the door gently opens to the sound of soft music, and lo, the most delicate of birds is before the most enamored of men. But what inexpressible dismay now overshadows the countenance of the Duke. Horror, dog, Baptiste, the bird. Good God, this bird, this modest bird. Shoot, I was going so well, kind of. This bird, modest bird that you, that is, something, that modest bird that you stripped of its feathers and that you served without paper. What? It is superfluous to say more. The Duke expired in a paroxysm of disgust. Oh, so it's talking about a legitimate omelet? Gently opens, and lo, the most delicate of birds is before the... Okay. Uh-huh. Ha ha ha, said his grace. Said some... said his grace on the 3rd day after his decease. He, replied the devil faintly, drawing himself up with an air of hauteur. Why, surely you are not serious, retorted the omelette, de l'Omelette. I have sinned, it is true. Yes? It is true. But my good sir, consider, you have no actual intention of putting such barbarous threats into execution. No, what? Said his majesty. Come, sir, strip. Strip indeed, very pretty, a faith. No, sir, I shall not strip. Who are you, pray, that I, Duke de l'Omelette, Prince de Foie Gras, just come of age, author of the Mazurkiad, and member of the Academy, should divest myself at your bidding of the sweetest pantaloons ever made by Bourdon, the daintiest clothing of the chamber ever put together by Rombert. Robe de chambre, the dress of the bedroom, bed dress, ever put together by Rombert, to say nothing of the taking my hair out of paper, not to mention the trouble I should have in drawing off my gloves. Who am I? Ah, true, I am Beelzebub, prince of the fly. I took thee just now from a rosewood coffin inlaid with ivory. Thou wast curiously scented and labelled as per invoice. Belial sent thee, my inspector of cemeteries. The pantaloons which thou sayest were made by Bourdon are an excellent pair of linen drawers, and thy robe de chambre is a shroud of no scanty dimensions. Sir, replied the Duke, I am not to be insulted with impunity. Sir, I shall take the earliest opportunity of avenging this insult. Sir, you shall hear from me. In the meantime, au revoir. And the Duke was bowing himself out of the satanic presence when he was interrupted and brought back by a gentleman in waiting. Hereupon his Grace rubbed his eyes, yawned, shrugged his shoulders, reflected. Having become satisfied of his identity, he took a bird's eye view of his whereabouts. The apartment was superb. Even de L'Omelette pronounced it good, something, uh, how it takes. I don't know. It was not its length nor its breadth, but its height. Ah, that was appalling. There was no ceiling, certainly none, but a dense whirling mass of fiery colored clouds. His Grace's brain reeled as he glanced upwards. From above hung a chain of unknown blood-red metal, its upper end lost, like the city of Boston, parmi les nues, among the clouds. From its nether extremity swung a large crescent. The Duke knew it to be a ruby, but from it there poured a light so intense, so still, so terrible. Persia never worshipped such. Geber never imagined such. Mussulman never dreamed of such when, drugged with opium, he has tottered to a bed of poppies, his back to the flowers and his face to the god Apollo. The Duke muttered a slight oath, decidedly approbatory. The corners of the room were rounded into niches. 3 of these were filled with statues of gigantic proportions. Their beauty was Grecian, their deformity Egyptian, their tout ensemble, their whole ensemble French. In the 4th niche, the statue was veiled. It was not colossal, but then there was a taper ankle, a sandaled foot. De L'Omelette pressed his hand upon his heart, closed his eyes, raised them, and caught his satanic majesty in a blush. But the paintings, Cuprus, Astarte, Estereth, 1,000 and the same, and Raphael has beheld them. Yes, Raphael has been here, for did he not paint the... And was he not consequently damned? The paintings, O luxury, O love! Who gazing on those forbidden beauties shall have eyes for the dainty devices of the golden frames that besprinkled, like stars, the hyacinth and the porphyry walls? But the Duke's heart is fainting within him. He is not, however, as you suppose, dizzy with magnificence, nor drunk with the ecstatic breath of those innumerable censers. It is true that he has thought a lot about these things. Dull. The Duke de L'Omelette is terror-stricken, for through the lurid vista, which a single uncurtained window is affording, lo, gleams the most ghastly of all fires. The poor Duke? Dang it! The poor Duke, I believe. The poor Duke. He could not help imagining that the glorious, the voluptuous, the never-dying melodies which pervaded that hall, as they passed filtered and transmuted through the alchemy of the enchanted window panes, were the wailings and the howlings of the hopeless and the damned. And there, too, there, upon the ottoman, who could he be? He, the little master? No, the deity. No, the deity, who sat as if carved in marble, and who... something, who smiles with his pale countenance so bitterly? Oh, shoot. But he... Urgh! Gosh darn it. But he must act. That is to say, a Frenchman never faints outright. Besides, his Grace hated a scene. De L'Omelette is himself again. There were some foils upon a table, some points also. The Duke had studied under B. Something about 6 men. He had killed, I was going to say that. He had killed his 6 men. Now then, he is able to escape. He can escape. He measures 2 points, and with a grace inimitable, offers His Majesty the choice. Horror! His Majesty does not fence. But something. Joy, how happy a thought. But His Grace had always an excellent memory. He had dipped in the devil of the Abbe Gualtier. Therein it is said that the devil does not hate or refuse a joy Descartes. Shoot. But the chances. Shoot! Ah! But the chances. True, desperate, but scarcely more desperate than the Duke. Besides, was he not in the secret? Was he not in the secrets? Had he not skimmed over Pere Lebrun? Was he not a member of the Club 21? Uh, if I lose, said he, I scrape do you what perdu? Uh, I will be too. Oh God, I shall be doubly damned. Oh, there, voila tout. Um, I just learned that. Here, His Grace shrugged his shoulders. If I win, I return to the ortolans that the cards something be prepared. I'm so sorry. His Grace was all care, all attention, His Majesty all confidence. A spectator would have thought of Francis and Charles. His Grace thought of his game. His Majesty did not think. He shuffled. The Duke cut. The cards are dealt. The trump is turned. It is the king. No, it was the queen. His Majesty cursed her masculine habiliments. De L'Omelette placed his hand upon his heart. They play. The Duke counts. The hand is out. His Majesty counts heavily, smiles, and is taking wine. The Duke slips a card. It is to you a fair, I don't know, said His Majesty, cutting. His Grace bowed, dealt, and arose from the table. In presentin le roi, the king? In presentment of the king? Blah. His Majesty looked chagrined. Had Alexander not been Alexander, he would have been Diogenes, and the Duke assured his antagonist in taking leave that that if he were not the Duke Omelette, he would not have the point of objection to beat the devil. I don't know. I'm sorry. That one was a disaster. At some point, maybe I'll come back to it. But we're just gonna go ahead with the next one. I liked the different writing of it, apart from the fact that I cannot yet read fluent French. Clearly. But yes, I was, again, the actual omelet and the bird thing. I assumed that was, metaphor or such. So, yeah, apologies for that entire thing. So we'll end with the oblong box, which I believe is another horror. Fun, great, excellent. I don't think there's as much French, if any. So we should be okay. The oblong box. Some years ago, I engaged passage from Charleston, South Carolina, to the city of New York in the fine packet ship Independence, Captain Hardy. We were to sail on the 15th of the month, June, weather permitting, and on the 14th I went on board to arrange some matters in my stateroom. I found that we were to have a great many passengers, including a more than usual number of ladies. On the list were several of my acquaintances, and among other names, I was rejoiced to see that of Mr. Cornelius Wyatt, a young artist for whom I entertained feelings of warm friendship. He had been with me a fellow student at C University, where we were very much together. He had the ordinary temperament of genius, and was a compound of misanthropy, sensibility, and enthusiasm. To these qualities he united the warmest and truest heart which ever beat in a human bosom. I observed that his name was carded upon 3 staterooms, and upon again referring to the list of passengers, I found that he had engaged passage for himself, wife, and 2 sisters, his own. The staterooms were sufficiently roomy, and each had 2 berths, one above the other. These berths, to be sure, were so exceedingly narrow as to be insufficient for more than 1 person. Still, I could not comprehend why there were 3 staterooms for these 4 persons. I was, just at that epoch, in one of those moody frames of mind which make a man abnormally inquisitive about trifles. Is it really a trifle? And I confess with shame that I busied myself in a variety of ill-bred and preposterous conjectures about this matter of the supernumerary stateroom. It was no business of mine, to be sure, but with none the less pertinacity did I occupy myself in attempts to resolve the enigma. At last I reached a conclusion which wrought in me great wonder why I had not arrived at it before. "It is a servant, of course," I said. "What a fool I am! No sooner to have thought of so obvious a solution." And then I again repaired to the list. But here I saw distinctly that no servant was to come with the party, although in fact it had been the original design to bring one, for the words "and servant" had been first written and then overscored. "Oh, extra baggage, to be sure," I now said to myself. Something he wishes something he wishes not to be put in the hold, something to be kept under his own eye. Ah, I have it. A painting or so, and this is what he has been bargaining about with Nicolina, the Italian Jew. This idea satisfied me, and I dismissed my curiosity for the nonce. Wyatt's two sisters I knew very well, and most amiable and clever girls they were. His wife he had newly married, and I had never yet seen her. He had often talked about her in my presence, however, and in his usual style of enthusiasm. He described her as of surpassing beauty, wit, and accomplishment. I was therefore quite anxious to make her acquaintance. On the day in which I visited the ship, the 14th, Wyatt and party were also to visit it, so the captain informed me, and I waited on board an hour longer than I had designed, in hope of being presented to the bride. But then an apology came. Mrs. W. was a little indisposed, and would decline coming on board until tomorrow, at the hour of sailing. The morrow having arrived, I was going from my hotel to the wharf, when Captain Hardy met me and said that, owing to circumstances, a stupid but convenient phrase, he rather thought the Independence would not sail for a day or two, and that when all was ready, he would send up and let me know. This I thought strange, for there was a stiff southerly breeze, but as these circumstances were not forthcoming, although I pumped for them with much perseverance, I had nothing to do but to return home and digest my impatience at leisure. I did not receive the expected message from the captain for nearly a week. It came at length, however, and I immediately went on board the ship. Hang on. It came at length, however, and I immediately went on board the ship, which was crowded with passengers, and everything was in the bustle attendant upon making sail. Wyatt's party arrived in about 10 minutes after myself. There were the two sisters, the bride, and the artist, the latter in one of his customary fits of moody misanthropy. I was too well used to these, however, to pay them any special attention. He did not even introduce me to his wife, this courtesy devolving, perforce, upon his sister Marian, a very sweet and intelligent girl, who in a few hurried words made us acquainted. Misanthropy, just like with you. Okay. Mrs. Oops. Heh. Mrs. Wyatt had been closely veiled, and when she raised her veil in acknowledging my bow, I confess that I was very profoundly astonished. I should have been much more so, however, had not long experience advised me not to trust with too implicit a reliance the enthusiastic descriptions of my friend the artist, when indulging in comments upon the loveliness of woman. When beauty was the theme, I well knew with what facility he soared into the regions of the purely ideal. The truth is, I could not help regarding Mrs. Wyatt as a decidedly plain-looking woman. If not positively ugly, she was not, I think, very far from it. She was dressed, however, in exquisite taste, and then I had no doubt that she had captivated my friend's heart by the more enduring graces of the intellect and soul. She said very few words and passed at once into her stateroom with Mr. W. My old inquisitiveness now returned. There was no servant. That was a settled point. I looked, therefore, for the extra baggage. After some delay, a cart arrived at the wharf with an oblong pine box, which was everything that seemed to be expected. Immediately upon its arrival, we made sail, and in a short time were safely over the bar and standing out to sea. I have a thought. I will be honest if I'm correct. Immediately upon its arrival, we made sail, and in a short time were safely over the bar and standing out to sea. The box in question was, as I say, oblong. It was about 6 feet in length by 2.5 in breadth. I observed it attentively and liked to be precise. Now this shape was peculiar, and no sooner had I seen it than I took credit to myself for the accuracy of my guessing. I had reached the conclusion, it will be remembered, that the extra baggage of my friend, the artist, would prove to be pictures, or at least a picture, for I knew he had been for several weeks in conference with Nicolino, and now here was a box which from its shape could possibly contain nothing in the world but a copy of Leonardo's Last Supper, and a copy of this very Last Supper, done by Rubini the Younger at Florence, I had known for some time to be in the possession of Nicolino. This point, therefore, I considered as sufficiently settled. I chuckled excessively when I thought of my acumen. I'm actually going to check the pronunciation of that one. Acumen, yep. It was the first time I had ever known Wyatt to keep from me any of his artistical secrets, but here he evidently intended to steal a march upon me and smuggle a fine picture to New York under my very nose. Expecting me to know nothing of the matter, I resolved to quiz him well, now and hereafter. One thing, however, annoyed me not a little. The box did not go into the extra stateroom. It was deposited in Wyatt's own, and thereto it remained, occupying very nearly the whole of the floor. No doubt, to the exceeding discomfort of the artist and his wife, this the more especially as the tar or paint with which it was lettered in sprawling capitals emitted a strong, disagreeable, and to my fancy, a peculiarly disgusting odor. On the lid were painted the words, Mrs. Adelaide Curtis, Albany, New York, charge of Cornelius Wyatt, Esquire, this side up, to be handled with care. Now I was aware that Mrs. Adelaide Curtis of Albany was the artist's wife's mother, but then I looked upon the whole address as a mystification, intended especially for myself. I made up my mind, of course, that the box and contents would never get farther north than the studio of my misanthropic friend in Chambers Street, New York. For the first 3 or 4 days we had fine weather, although the wind was dead ahead, having chopped around to the northward immediately upon our losing sight of the coast. The passengers were consequently in high spirits and disposed to be social. I must except, however, Wyatt and his sisters, who behaved stiffly, and, I could not help thinking, uncourteously to the rest of the party. Wyatt's conduct I did not so much regard. He was gloomy, even beyond his usual habit. In fact, he was morose, but in him I was prepared for eccentricity. For the sisters, however, I could make no excuse. They secluded him. Oh, sorry, but in him I was prepared for eccentricity. For the sisters, however, I could make no excuse. They secluded themselves in their staterooms during the greater part of the passage, and absolutely refused, although I repeatedly urged them, to hold communication with any person on board. Mrs. Wyatt herself was far more agreeable. That is to say, she was chatty, and to be chatty is no slight recommendation at sea. She became excessively intimate with most of the ladies, and to my profound astonishment, evinced no equivocal disposition to coquet with the men. She amused us all very much. I say amused, and scarcely know how to explain myself. The truth is, I soon found that Mrs. W. was far oftener laughed at than with. The gentlemen said little about her, but the ladies in a little while pronounced her a good-hearted thing, rather indifferent-looking, totally uneducated, and decidedly vulgar. The great wonder was how Wyatt had been entrapped into such a match. Wealth was the general solution, but this I knew to be no solution at all, for Wyatt had told me that she neither brought him a dollar nor had any expectations from any source whatever. He had married, he said, for love, and for love only, and his bride was far more than worthy of his love. When I thought of these expressions on the part of my friend, I confess that I felt indescribably puzzled. Could it be possible that he was taking leave of his senses? What else could I think? He, so refined, so intellectual, so fastidious, with so exquisite a perception of the faulty, and so keen an appreciation of the beautiful. To be sure, the lady seemed especially fond of him, particularly so in his absence, when she made herself ridiculous by frequent quotations of what had been said by her beloved husband, Mr. Wyatt. The word husband seemed forever, to use one of her own delicate expressions, forever on the tip of her tongue. In the meantime, it was observed by all on board that he avoided her in the most pointed manner, and for the most part shut himself up alone in his stateroom, where, in fact, he might have been said to live altogether, leaving his wife at full liberty to amuse herself as she thought best in the public society of the main cabin. My conclusion from what I saw and heard was that the artist, by some unaccountable freak of fate, or perhaps in some fit of enthusiastic and fanciful passion, had been induced to unite himself with a person altogether beneath him, and that the natural result, entire and speedy disgust had ensued. I pitied him from the bottom of my heart, but could not for that reason quite forgive his incommunicativeness in the matter of the Last Supper. For this I resolved to have my revenge. One day he came upon deck, and taking his arm as had been my wont, I sauntered with him backwards and forwards. His gloom, however, which I considered quite natural under the circumstances, seemed entirely unabated. He said little, and that moodily, and with evident effort. I ventured a jest or two, and he made a sickening attempt at a smile. Poor fellow, as I thought of his wife, I wondered what he could have what he could have heart to put on. I wondered that. I'm sorry. Poor fellow, as I thought of his wife, I wondered that he could have heart to put on even the semblance of mirth. At last I ventured a home thrust. I determined to commence a series of covert insinuations, or innuendos, about the oblong box, just to let him perceive gradually that I was not altogether the butt or victim of his little bit of pleasant mystification. My first observation was by way of opening a masked battery. I said something about the peculiar shape of that box, and as I spoke the words, I smiled knowingly, winked, and touched him gently with my forefinger in the ribs. The manner in which Wyatt received this harmless pleasantry convinced me at once that he was mad. At first he stared at me as if he found it impossible to comprehend the witticism of my remark, but as its point seemed slowly to make its way into his brain, his eyes in the same proportion seemed protruding from their sockets. Then he grew very red, then hideously pale, then, as if highly amused with what I had insinuated, he began a loud and boisterous laugh, which, to my astonishment, he kept up. He kept up, with gradually increasing vigor, for 10 minutes or more. In conclusion, he fell flat and heavily upon the deck. When I ran to uplift him, to all appearance, he was dead. I called assistance, and with much difficulty we brought him to himself. Upon reviving, he spoke incoherently for some time. At length we bled him and put him to bed. The next morning he was quite recovered, so far as regarded his mere bodily health. Of his mind I say nothing, of course. I avoided him during the rest of the passage, by advice of the captain, who seemed to coincide with me altogether in my views of his insanity, but cautioned me to say nothing on this head to any person on board. I have had several theories, none of which I have stuck with. So we shall see. Several circumstances occurred immediately after this fit of Wyatt's, which contributed to heighten the curiosity with which I was already possessed. Among other things, I had been nervous. Ooh, I have another thought. Among other things, I had been nervous, drank too much strong green tea, and slept ill at night. In fact, for 2 nights I could not be properly said to sleep at all. Now my stateroom opened into the main cabin, or dining room, as did those of all the single men on board. Wyatt's 3 rooms were in the after cabin, which was separated from the main one by a slight sliding door, never locked even at night. As we were almost constantly on a wind, and the breeze was not a little stiff, the ship heeled to leeward very considerably, and whenever her starboard side was to leeward, the sliding door between the cabins slid open, and so remained, nobody taking the trouble to get up and shut it. But my berth was in such a position that when my own stateroom door was open, as well as the sliding door in question, and my own door was always open on account of the heat, I could see into the after cabin quite distinctly, and just at that portion of it too, where were situated the staterooms of Mr. Wyatt. During 2 nights, not consecutive, while I lay awake, I clearly saw Mrs. W. about 11 o'clock upon each night, steal cautiously from the stateroom of Mr. W. and enter the extra room, where she remained until daybreak, when she was called by her husband and went back. That they were virtually separated was clear. They had separate apartments, no doubt in contemplation of a more permanent divorce, and here, after all, I thought, was the mystery of the extra stateroom. There was another circumstance, too, which interested me much. During the 2 wakeful nights in question, and immediately after the disappearance of Mrs. Wyatt into the extra stateroom, I was attracted by certain singular, cautious, subdued noises in that of her husband. After listening to them for some time, with thoughtful attention, I at length succeeded perfectly in translating their import. They were sounds occasioned by the artist in prying open the oblong box, by means of a chisel and mallet, the latter being apparently muffled or deadened by some soft woolen or cotton substance in which its head was enveloped. In the manner I fancied I could distinguish the precise moment when he fairly disengaged the lid, also that I could determine when he removed it altogether, and when he deposited it upon the lower berth in his room. This latter point I knew, for example, by certain slight taps which the lid made in striking against the wooden edges of the berth, as he endeavored to lay it down very gently, there being no room for it on the floor. After this, there was a dead stillness, and I heard nothing more, upon either occasion, until nearly daybreak, unless, perhaps, I may mention a low sobbing or murmuring sound, so very much suppressed as to be nearly inaudible. if indeed the whole of this latter noise were not rather produced by my own imagination. I say it seemed to resemble sobbing or sighing, but of course it could not have been either. I rather think it was a ringing in my own ears. Mr. Wyatt, no doubt, according to custom, was merely giving the rein to one of his hobbies, indulging in one of his fits of artistic enthusiasm. He had opened his oblong box in order to feast his eyes on the pictorial treasure within. There was nothing in this, however, to make him sob. I repeat, therefore, that it must have been simply a freak of my own fancy, distempered by good Captain Hardy's green tea. Just before dawn, on each of the 2 nights of which I speak, I distinctly heard Mr. Wyatt replace the lid upon the oblong box and force the nails into their old places by means of the muffled mallet. Having done this, he issued from his stateroom, fully dressed, and proceeded to call Mrs. W. from hers. We had been at sea 7 days, and were now off Cape Hatteras, when there came a tremendously heavy blow from the southwest. We were in a measure prepared for it, however, as the weather had been holding out threats for some time. Everything was made snug, alow and aloft. Ooh, I like that. Alow and aloft, and as the wind steadily freshened, we lay to, at length, under spanker and fore topsail, both double reefed. In this trim we rode safely enough for 48 hours, the ship proving herself an excellent sea-boat in many respects, and shipping no water of any consequence. At the end of this period, however, the gale had freshened into a hurricane, and our aftersails split into ribbons, bringing us so much in the trough of the water that we shipped several prodigious seas, one immediately after the other. By this accident we lost 3 men overboard with the caboose, and nearly the whole of the larboard bulwarks. Scarcely had we recovered our senses before the foretopsail went into shreds. When we got up a storm staysail, and with this did pretty well for some hours, the ship heading the sea much more steadily than before. The gale still held on, however, and we saw no signs of its abating. The rigging was found to be ill-fitted and greatly strained, and on the 3rd day of the blow, about 5 in the afternoon, our mizzen-mast, in a heavy lurch to windward, went by the board. For an hour or more we tried in vain to get rid of it, on account of the prodigious rolling of the ship, and before we had succeeded, the carpenter came aft and announced 4 feet water in the hold. To add to our dilemma, we found the pumps choked and nearly useless. All was now confusion and despair, but an effort was made to lighten the ship by throwing overboard as much of her cargo as could be reached, and by cutting away the 2 masts that remained. This we at last accomplished, but we were still unable to do anything at the pumps, and in the meantime the leak gained on us very fast. At sundown the gale had sensibly diminished in violence, and as the sea went down with it, we still entertained faint hopes of saving ourselves and the boats. At 8 p.m. the clouds broke away to windward, and we had the advantage of a full moon, a piece of good fortune which served wonderfully to cheer our drooping spirits. After incredible labor we succeeded, at length, in getting the longboat over the side without material accident, and into this we crowded the whole of the crew and most of the passengers. This party made off immediately, and after undergoing much suffering, finally arrived in safety at Ocracoke Inlet on the 3rd day after the wreck. 14 passengers with the captain remained on board, resolving to trust their fortunes to the jolly boat at the stern. We lowered it without difficulty, although it was only by a miracle that we prevented it from swamping as it touched the water. It contained, when afloat, the captain and his wife, Mr. Wyatt and party, a Mexican officer, wife, 4 children, and myself, with a Negro valet. We had no room, of course, for anything except a few positively necessary instruments, some provision, and the clothes upon our backs. No one had thought of even attempting to save anything more. What must have been the astonishment of all, then, when, having proceeded a few fathoms from the ship, Mr. Wyatt stood up in the stern sheets and coolly demanded of Captain Hardy that the boat should be put back for the purpose of taking in his oblong box. "Sit down, Mr. Wyatt," replied the captain somewhat sternly. "You will capsize us if you do not sit quite still. Our gunwale is almost in the water now." "The box," vociferated Mr. Wyatt, still standing. "The box, I say. Captain Hardy, you will not refuse me. Its weight will be but a trifle. It is nothing, mere nothing. By the mother who bore you, for the love of heaven, by your hope of salvation, I implore you to put back for the box." The captain for a moment seemed touched by the earnest appeal of the artist, but he regained his stern composure and merely said, "Mr. Wyatt, you are mad. I cannot listen to you. Sit down, I say, or you will swamp the boat. Stay, hold him, seize him. He is about to spring overboard. There, I knew it. He is over." As the captain said this, Mr. Wyatt in fact sprang from the boat and, as we were yet in the lee of the wreck, succeeded by almost superhuman exertion in getting hold of a rope which hung from the forechains. In another moment he was on board and rushing frantically down into the cabin. In the meantime, we had been swept astern of the ship, and being quite out of her lee, were at the mercy of the tremendous sea which was still running. We made a determined effort to put back, but our little boat was like a feather in the breath of the tempest. We saw at a glance that the doom of the unfortunate artist was sealed. For our distance from the wreck rapidly increased. The madman, for as such only could we regard him, was seen to emerge from the companionway, up which, by dint of a strength that appeared gigantic, he dragged bodily the oblong box. While we gazed in the extremity of astonishment, he passed rapidly several turns of a 3-inch rope, first around the box and then around his body. In another instant, both body and box were in the sea, disappearing suddenly at once and forever. We lingered a while sadly upon our oars, with our eyes riveted upon the spot. At length we pulled away. The silence remained, unbroken for an hour. Finally, I hazarded a remark. "Did you observe, Captain, how suddenly they sank? Was not that an exceedingly singular thing? I confess that I entertained some feeble hope of his deliverance, when I saw him lash himself to the box and commit himself to the sea." "They sank as a matter of course," replied the captain, "and that like a shot. They will soon rise again, however, but not till the salt melts." "The salt!" I ejaculated. "Hush!" said the captain, pointing to the wife and sisters of the deceased. "We must talk of these things at some more appropriate time." We suffered much and made a narrow escape, but fortune befriended us, as well as our mates in the longboat. We landed in fine, more dead than alive, after 4 days of intense distress, upon the beach opposite Roanoke Island. We remained here a week, were not ill-treated by the wreckers, and at length obtained a passage to New York. About a month after the loss of the Independence, I happened to meet Captain Hardy in Broadway. Our conversation turned naturally upon the disaster, and especially upon the sad fate of poor Wyatt. I thus learned the following particulars. The artist had engaged passage for himself, wife, 2 sisters, and a servant. His wife was indeed, as she had been represented, a most lovely and most accomplished woman. On the morning of the 14th of June, the day in which I first visited the ship, the lady suddenly sickened and died. The young husband was frantic with grief, but circumstances imperatively forbade the deferring his voyage to New York. It was necessary to take to her mother the corpse of his adored wife, and on the other hand, the universal prejudice which would prevent his doing so openly. I knew it. It was necessary to take to her mother the corpse of his adored wife, and on the other hand, the universal prejudice which would prevent his doing so openly was well known. 9/10 of the passengers would have abandoned the ship rather than take passage with a dead body. In this dilemma, Captain Hardy arranged that the corpse, being first partially embalmed and packed with a large quantity of salts in a box of suitable dimensions, should be conveyed on board as merchandise. Nothing was to be said of the lady's decease, and as it was well understood that Mr. Wyatt had engaged passage for his wife, it became necessary that some person should personate her during the voyage. This the deceased lady's maid was easily prevailed on to do. The extra stateroom, originally engaged for this girl during her mistress's life, was now merely retained. In this stateroom, the pseudo-wife slept, of course, every night. In the daytime she performed, to the best of her ability, the part of her mistress, whose person it had been carefully ascertained was unknown to any of the passengers on board. My own mistakes arose, naturally enough, through too careless, too inquisitive, and too impulsive a temperament. But of late it is a rare thing that I sleep soundly at night. There is a countenance which haunts me, turn as I will. There is an hysterical laugh which will forever ring within my ears. Ooh, I did. I figured it out towards the end there. Where was the hysterical laughter? Harmless pleasantry. So was by way, peculiar shape of that box. Yeah. Yeah. Damn. Sorry again. They sank as a matter of course, and that like a shot. They will soon rise again, however, but not till the salt melts. Ooh, so good. And yes, I do. That one is one I must end upon. Um, And I had a good time. I will figure out what's going wrong with the stream and hopefully be better able to get it to work, I guess. That's all. Sorry. So yes, that was Short Stories by Edgar Allan Poe. A curious mixture, and yeah, he did. He had a grasp of the horror and the comedy. I found very great. It was a little dry in the middle, but I don't mind that. And then it was exquisite there at the end. So yes, that is all. This has been Let's Read with Edgar Allan Poe. Uh, thanks for coming, whoever got lost and somehow found their way here or found their way back. I appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed it. I did, very much so. Um, hope to see you again soon. It will be Thursday for watching. I'm not sure what yet. And then more games on Sunday and more Poe, starting with King Pest, I assume, on Sunday. I think. Yes, yes, on Sunday. The next Sunday and potentially the Tuesday, I won't be able to. But for now, the schedule remains the same. So, yes, thank you. Oh no, I have to get my thing together. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And bye.